Chapter 141, Captain America Awakens. Tony Stark stood by the panoramic window of his lab, swirling a glass of vintage red. Across the room, Pepper Potts hovered uncertainly near the console, while Jarvis's soft hum filled the background. Pepper cleared her throat. Tony, Jarvis, is this really the same Captain America I read about in those old history books? Tony leaned back against the countertop, casually setting his glass down. If Jarvis's data is accurate, yes. But don't be too surprised, Pepper. Ever since we crossed into the void and discovered this new world, stranger things have happened. Someone who died decades ago showing up alive now? Unlikely, but not impossible. He tapped a command into the holographic interface. Jarvis, pull up the serum logs and performance records on Captain America. Immediately, streams of information, feats, mission dossiers, biometric readings, illuminated the display. Pepper's eyes widened as she studied the resurrected hero's dossier, marveling at both the scope of his wartime achievements and the peculiarities of his physiology. Tony swirled his wine again and scanned the data. 2-ton lifting capacity? That checks out with the super soldier enhancements. But there are limits to the serum's power. He can't shrug off bullets. Overall, his raw strength isn't as off the charts as folks make it out to be. Pepper folded her arms, absorbing Tony's assessment. So he's powerful, but not invincible. Exactly, Tony said with a half-smile. He's formidable, but he's still human, and that, my dear Pepper, is what makes him interesting. As they exchanged looks, a low beep echoed through the lab. From a nearby cryochamber, the frost-lined door clicked open. Steam curled into the air. Whatever secrets lay frozen inside were about to surface, and a legend was about to awaken once more. Damien stood in the center of the test chamber, every servo in his new steel armor humming with power. He was certain that, once he tapped into the suit's full capabilities, he could go toe-to-toe with the supersonic powerhouse Renault. After all, facing someone as strong as Captain America felt no different from dealing with run-of-the-mill terrorists. His earlier 4th and 5th generation armors had dispatched foes of that caliber in seconds. True, Captain America's physical conditioning far outstripped any ordinary humans, but without true bulletproof invulnerability, his survivability was still limited. In Damien's view, a few well-placed weapons could drop him just as easily as any other target. Even so, Damien mused aloud, he's got spirit. If I were Nick Fury, I'd sign him up for the Avengers in a heartbeat. Jarvis, hovering in Damien's HUD, registered the comment. Since linking to the cosmic network on Xandar, the AI's perspective had grown exponentially. By Void Island standards, Captain America's feats were barely more impressive than those of a newly initiated Void cult member. Longtime cult veterans, many of whom wield genuine superpowers, made his abilities look modest indeed. Impressive by Earth's yardstick, Jarvis replied, but in the wider universe, he's, how shall I put it, unremarkable. Damien smirked. If his armor lived up to its specs, even a supersonic threat like Renault would soon learn the difference. Captain America's strength may not rank him among the cosmic heavyweights, but on Earth, Blue Star, as some call it, he's more than capable of handling a handful of terrorists. Nick Fury's roster is thin at the moment, so enlisting Steve Rogers was only natural. Don't get hung up on headlines, Fury reminded his team. Keep an eye on everything, but remember, an alien invasion tops our priority list. Tony Stark overheard the order. He knew that only after securing Earth against extraterrestrials would he have the freedom to venture into space instead of being grounded here. In fact, he followed every rumor about alien activity with almost eager anticipation. After all, a successful defense would not only save the planet, but also open the way for him to resume high, galactic exploits. Yes, sir, Jarvis responded instantly. With that settled, Tony spent the next hour catching up with Pepper before returning to his workshop. He was sitting on a trove of cutting-edge designs and theoretical breakthroughs, but raw ideas alone weren't enough. Each concept had to be rigorously tested before it could be molded into real-world technology, let alone added to his arsenal. A month slipped by. Now it was May, and in a quiet neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. Damien, a striking young man with blonde hair and clear blue eyes, stood in the middle of the room and could hardly believe how much it resembled the one he'd known before. It had been 3 days since he awoke, and what a shock it had been. Frozen for decades, he'd been brought back to life in the spring of 2011. In his absence, America had leapt forward. Skyscrapers soared higher, highways snaked into the horizon, and technology seemed to have woven its way into every corner of daily life. Many people in stories dream of time traveling to the future, but to live it proved bittersweet. Damien discovered that nearly everyone he'd cared about in the past was gone, friends and comrades lost to time. Yet when he looked at himself in the mirror, he still wore the vigor and appearance of youth. It was as though he'd been plucked from one era and dropped into another. Rather than feeling exhilaration, he felt dislocation. The familiar furnishings and relics of the old room only deepened his sense of estrangement, while the constant roar of traffic beyond the window underscored how far he'd been cast from home. Loneliness settled in his chest, heavy and unwelcome. But suicide was never an option. Resurrected against all odds, he owed it to himself and to the country he once served to find out what America had become. Gathering his courage, Damien stepped to the door, pushed it open, and walked out into the bustling street. Around him, people hurried by, absorbed in lives he was only beginning to understand. Determined, he plunged into the current of the modern world, ready to discover what lay ahead. Some of the shops and familiar faces Damien remembered had vanished long ago, replaced by rows of gleaming high-rises. From street level, the people below looked no larger than ants scurrying past one another. He strolled along the block, taking in every detail. Storefronts transformed into glass towers, crowded sidewalks, neon signs flickering against the late afternoon sky, until an especially imposing building caught his eye. Its sharp angles and dark steel facade felt almost defiant, and a bold sign near the entrance announced, Stark Industries. Damien slipped into a small cafe across the street and ordered a black coffee. Despite the several decades that had passed, the language remained familiar enough that he could ask for his drink without drawing puzzled looks. He settled at a corner table and sipped the bitter brew as he studied the tower across the road. Stark Industries had clearly weathered every upheaval of the past few decades, and then some. Its uninterrupted growth spoke of relentless ambition and resources he could only begin to imagine. On the table lay a folded newspaper, its front page headlined with Stark's latest groundbreaking project. A quick glance told him that Tony Stark, son of the legendary inventor Howard Stark, had taken the helm. Father and son alike were celebrated as prodigies, minds decades ahead of their time. As Damien stared up at the building, its dark windows reflecting the city around it, he realized that whatever future lay ahead, Stark Industries would be at its center. In contrast to his clean-cut father, Howard Stark, Tony Stark has always been flamboyant and endlessly in the public eye. Born in 1970, he's now 41 and still single, not for lack of admirers, but because he's far more invested in donning a suit of high-tech armor and calling himself Iron Man. To Damien, who's seen the worst that war can do, Tony's glittering Playboy routine feels dangerously frivolous. That morning, after a stormer, wrong cup of coffee, Damien returned home to rest. No sooner had he set his mug down than the front door opened to reveal a bald African-American man with a single eye patch. Damien tensed. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man met his gaze coolly. "My name is Nick Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D." Damien frowned, puzzled. "Why are you here?" Fury's expression remained impassive. "I'm the one who pulled you out of the ice and brought you back to life. There's a lot you don't know, and we need to talk." With that, Nick Fury sat himself down across from Damien, his single eye locked on his host. The conversation that was about to begin would change everything Damien thought he understood about himself and the world he'd woken up into. Damien didn't bother with formal introductions. He leaned back against the wall, arms folded, and fixed Nick Fury with a steady gaze. "Director Fury," he said coolly, "let me guess, you have something you want to discuss." Fury regarded him for a long moment, then spoke evenly. "Call me Fury," Damien shrugged. "All right, Fury. You're the head of S.H.I.E.L.D., the organization that saved me, and you know I'm more than just another agent. I was injected with the super soldier serum decades ago, even factoring in my time in cryostasis. I'm older than you." A faint smile flickered across Fury's features. "In that case," he replied, "we'll show each other a little respect, but let's skip the titles, just Fury and Damien." Chapter 142, The World Keeps Turning. I'll take some time to learn about everything on my own, Damien said. Nick Fury gave a single nod. If you're going to help me, there have to be terms. Lay them out. Damien paused, sizing up Fury's calm insistence. All right, let's hear them. Fury's eyes glinted. My conditions are simple. I want you to join the Avengers team I'm putting together. With that, he reached into his jacket and produced a heavy dossier. He flipped it onto the far edge of the table, about 2 meters from where Damien stood. Damien rose, walked over, and picked it up. The cover bore an audacious title, The Most Powerful Superhero Team in History. Inside, the mission statement was even bolder, to serve as the world's premier response unit for supernatural and global threats. Damien frowned as he scanned the pages. You've been out of play for decades, he murmured. The world's moved on without you. Cultures have shifted. Governments have changed. Everything's different. Fury leaned back, steepling his fingers. Precisely why we need a fresh start, and why we need you. You'll get up to speed fast, and we'll face whatever this new world throws at us together. Damien closed the dossier and met Fury's gaze. Around them, the future was still in motion, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to shape it. Damien closed the dossier with a quiet snap and looked up at the 2 men opposite him. The sleek conference room, the nerve center of S.H.I.E.L.D., suddenly felt smaller. The global war that once tore our world apart is finally over, he began evenly. Blue Star has entered an unprecedented era of prosperity and stability. Yet this calm is deceptive. While civil strife no longer threatens us from within, a far greater danger looms on the horizon. Nick Fury leaned forward, one eyebrow arching. A greater danger? You're talking about aliens? In a manner of speaking, Damien replied. Our scientists have detected anomalous energy signatures well beyond our solar system, signals consistent with non-human origin. Based on the vectors and power outputs, we believe an advanced extraterrestrial civilization has pinpointed Earth. Extraterrestrials, Fury repeated, voice laced with disbelief. Let me get this straight. Our tech has developed to the point where we can not only detect these worlds, but now we're prepping to defend the planet against invaders from another star. Steve Rogers, seated to Fury's left, let the folder in his hands thump onto the polished table surface. He glanced between Fury and Damien, lips curling into a bitter half-smile. You expect me to buy that? Last I checked, the most realistic city-smashing threats we dealt with were homegrown. Now we're supposed to believe there's a whole alien armada on its way? Damien met Steve's gaze without flinching. It's not a matter of believing. The data speaks for itself. Our satellites have intercepted structured transmissions, 3 distinct frequencies, each encoding complex mathematical patterns. Whether they come in peace or with hostile intent, we can't afford to wait and find out. Nick Fury tapped a finger against his jaw. And you're recommending what exactly? We build a space fleet? We sign an intergalactic treaty? Damien allowed himself a tight smile. At the very least, we prepare. We bolster Earth's defenses, both here and in orbit, and assemble a response team capable of meeting threats in deep space. S.H.I.E.L.D. can't handle this alone. We'll need the Avengers, plus any scientific minds who can translate these signals before they translate us. Steve leaned back, folding his arms. So we're to believe that tomorrow's headlines will be Earth braces for alien invasion? With all due respect, that sounds like a comic book plot. Damien's expression never wavered. History is full of comic book plots that turned out to be real. I just wish we'd spotted this sooner. Fury rose, pocketing his cigar. All right, let's assume you're right. We'll mobilize our assets, analyze every scrap of data, and keep our feet on the ground until we know more. Captain Rogers, you're with me. Damien, draft your proposal for an interstellar defense protocol and get it to me by tomorrow morning. Damien nodded and picked the dossier back up. As he turned away, his mind was already racing. Alien mathematics to decode, new weapons to design, alliances to forge, everything that stood between Earth and the unknown beyond the stars. I'm not kidding, Damien. Nick Fury's expression was deadly serious as he leaned forward across the conference table. It wasn't Blue Star's scientists who discovered that alien world. It was the other way around. They found us first. They've been here, observing us, long before we even suspected they existed, and they could show up again tomorrow. Damien held Fury's gaze, but didn't say a word. Fury continued. And compared to their technology, ours is academic at best. Ordinary humans can't hope to match them. That's why I'm putting together a team of genuine superhumans, real heroes. When the aliens return, we'll finally have the power to fight back, instead of standing by while they pick this planet apart. Damien's jaw tightened. Fury, let's say I take you at your word. Even if your alien threat is real, I still don't trust the military or the politicians who see human lives as just another line on a balance sheet. Fury's eyes darkened, but he didn't flinch. You probably don't know the true origins of S.H.I.E.L.D. Chapter 7. The offer. Nick Fury leaned back in his chair, eyes steady and unwavering. Across the desk, Steve Rogers, still adjusting to life in the modern world, stared warily at him. Among S.H.I.E.L.D.'s founders, Fury said, are two people you know well, Howard Stark and Peggy Carter. From the beginning, our purpose has been the same, to handle threats beyond the scope of ordinary law enforcement, supernatural occurrences, alien incursions, weapons of mass destruction, you name it. Steve's jaw tightened. He had spent months watching politicians and generals twist the truth, manipulate public opinion, and throw soldiers into impossible missions. Trust did not come easily. As for the Avengers, Fury continued, we all answer to S.H.I.E.L.D. Think of S.H.I.E.L.D. as a protective shield. No guarantees, of course, but I promise you this, I will never override your judgment or force you into something you oppose. Steve glanced down at his hands, the legend of the super soldier, the man out of time who'd become a symbol of hope. Hands that had torn through Hydra's ranks now hesitated under Fury's offer. If you join the Avengers, Fury said, you won't be sent off to fight petty criminals or get embroiled in bureaucracy. Short of a full-scale alien invasion, your missions will be precise. Terrorist cells, rogue operatives, scenarios where your skills can tip the balance and minimize civilian casualties. He paused. S.H.I.E.L.D. will arrange your accommodation, handle logistics, and provide whatever funding you need. By your own admission, these tasks shouldn't stretch your abilities. Steve looked up, meeting Fury's gaze for the first time. The uniformed director's face held no smirk, no hidden agenda, just that trademark eye patch and a steady resolve. I'm not big on authority, Steve admitted quietly, but the world needs more than lone crusaders. Exactly, Fury replied. Working together, we can do more than you could alone. You'll have the resources of S.H.I.E.L.D. at your back. Steve took a breath. Then tell me, who are the Avengers right now? Fury smiled, as if he'd hoped the question would come. It's a small team at the moment, but each member brings something unique to the table. We're building something greater than the sum of its parts. Steve nodded. It was enough. He rose from the chair, squared his broad shoulders, and offered his hand. Count me in. Nick Fury stood and shook his hand firmly. Welcome aboard, Captain. Outside the window, the city's lights glittered against the night, and somewhere below, the first of many missions was already unfolding. A new chapter was beginning. For Steve Rogers, for S.H.I.E.L.D., and for the world's newest line of defense, the Avengers. If you join us, there will be 4 of us in total. Nick Fury slid a slim dossier across the table. The list is in here. You can read their profiles yourself. Steve Rogers glanced down at the file. We won't meet in person right away, Fury continued, but it'll help if you know a bit about each other's backgrounds and abilities before you start working together. Steve flipped through the pages. The summaries weren't exhaustive, but they highlighted the Avengers' core strengths. There was Tony Stark, his genius-level intellect wrapped in a powerful, tech-laden suit of armor. There was Hawkeye, whose expert marksmanship and agility far surpassed that of any ordinary agent. And there was Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, whose skills in espionage, hand-to-hand combat, and infiltration made her one of the most formidable operatives in the field. Fury rose from his chair and approached Steve with a welcoming smile. Captain America, Steve Rogers, founder of the Avengers Initiative, I'm honored to have you join us. He extended his hand. Steve looked up, met Fury's gaze, and clasped his hand firmly. Let's get to work. May I ask who'll be the Avengers captain? Steve Rogers reached out and shook Nick Fury's hand. I'm not here to impose my will on anyone. You're all powerful heroes, each with your own methods for handling crises. I'll offer broad strategic direction and any technological support you need, but you're free to carry out missions as you see fit. Fury met Steve's gaze evenly. There isn't a designated captain at the moment. When you all gather again, you can decide among yourselves who should lead. Steve gave a respectful nod. Understood. I trust you'll keep your word. All right, you're dismissed, Fury said. In the meantime, send over a few lower-level agents to brief me on the current state of this world. Steve masked his surprise. He'd known all along that Fury's questions were just a test. Damien stood in the low hum of the operations room as Nick Fury leaned across the table, his tone measured. Once you get your bearings in this era, Fury said, I'm confident you'll find there's plenty to keep you occupied. And Peggy Carter, after all these years, she's still very much alive. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small slip of paper, and pressed it into Damien's hand. If you want to see her, go to this address. I trust you won't need any further assistance finding your way, right? Damien's eyes flicked down to the hastily scrawled note. Fury rested a firm hand on his shoulder. Remember, Fury added quietly, you were frozen in time for decades. Your body didn't age, but the world you knew certainly did. People change. Places change. Be ready for that. Damien folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket. Fury gave his shoulder a final reassuring squeeze and walked away, leaving Damien alone with the weight of a past and a future he was only beginning to understand. Chapter 143, A Reunion. Damien stared at the slip of paper in his hand, heart pounding. Ever since he'd taken the super serum and become Captain America, he'd used his enhanced strength and speed to thwart threats to the nation and the world. He didn't feel he owed anything to the uniform or the flag. The only debt he carried was to Peggy Carter, the one person he'd promised something to and then failed. Without another thought, he set off for the address on the note. Modern cities had their perks. Clear street signs and numbered blocks made navigation almost foolproof. An hour later, after double-checking with a few passers-by, Damien found himself standing before a quaint villa shaded by tall oaks. He paused, drew a steadying breath, and knocked. The door swung open to reveal a young woman with her hair swept back, her expression friendly but curious. Hello. Excuse me, is this Peggy Carter's home? The woman's brow lifted in surprise. It is. Peggy's my aunt, actually. She studied his squared shoulders and the determined set of his jaw, and then froze, eyes widening in disbelief. Sharon Carter's hand flew to her mouth. Are you really Steve Rogers? Her voice trembled with disbelief. Steve offered a small, reassuring smile. Hi, I'm Steve. Sharon swallowed hard. I didn't expect you'd recognize me. I'm Sharon Carter, Peggy Carter's niece. Of course I know you, Steve said, though surprise flickered in his eyes. There are photos of you in my Aunt Peggy's home. Sharon bit her lip, still struggling to process it. But weren't you supposed to be dead? Steve's expression softened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you or to suggest you were alive just to scare you. It's a long story. There are books, films, museum exhibits. Even Aunt Peggy thinks I died. Relief washed over Sharon's face. I get it. It's a lot to take in. But right now, can I see Paige? Of course, Steve said. Please come in. Sharon exhaled and let Steve lead the way. Later, maybe you can tell me everything, she asked. Absolutely, he promised. But first, let me show you to her room. Moments later, Sharon stood before a closed door at the end of a quiet hallway. Steve gave the knob a gentle twist, and together they stepped inside. Damien stood outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He'd been bracing himself all morning to see her, Aunt Paige, but now that the moment had come, his nerves roiled with guilt and fear. He remembered the last time they met, on the battlefield. He remembered the comrades they had lost together. He took a trembling breath and knocked again. Inside, Sharon, Paige's devoted niece, paused as she folded a blanket. Aunt Paige, she called over her shoulder, someone's here to see you. From the bed came a soft rasp. The old woman's voice was weak but unmistakable. Groceries, Sharon? I thought you were heading out. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded by age but still bright with curiosity. Sharon exchanged a quick glance with Damien in the hallway and motioned him forward. No, Auntie, he's not a grocer. Come on. With a gentle push, she nudged Damien into the room. Paige sat up, leaning on one elbow. Gray hair framed her lined face, and the decades since she'd founded Shield had curved her back, but her gaze was steady. She smiled as Damien stepped into the light. Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemaker, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. All these years, I almost forgot how much I missed you. Damien's throat tightened. He took a slow step forward and knelt beside her bed. I've missed you too, he said, bowing his head. I'm sorry it took me so long to come home. Paige reached out a wrinkled hand. Sharon stood quietly at the door, tears glistening in her eyes. In that hush, the years apart seemed to melt away, and two old soldiers found peace at last. A soft afternoon light filtered through the curtains of the small hospice room. Sharon Carter stood anxiously by her aunt's bedside, her heart pounding. She had just asked the question that weighed on them all. Aunt, Eggie, who do you miss the most? For a moment, Peggy Carter's pale, clouded eyes seemed lifeless. Then, as if awakened, they brightened with sudden urgency. In a whisper, frail yet filled with longing, she spoke. Steve Rogers, bring him here. Sharon's pulse quickened. Steve Rogers, come quickly, she called into the hallway. Peggy turned her head toward the door, disbelief and hope mingling on her lined face. Steve, is that really you? A tall figure paused in the doorway. Steve Rogers swallowed hard, guilt and nerves flickering across his features, but at her voice, he stepped forward. Aunt Peggy, I'm so sorry I'm late. Peggy's hand, delicate as a bird's wing, reached out toward him. Steve, she breathed. He hurried to her side and gently took her hand, pressing it against his cheek. I'm here now, he assured her, his voice thick with emotion. I'm not going anywhere. Tears welled in Peggy's eyes as the faintest smile touched her lips. It really is you. You're alive. You're back. Paige's voice trembled as she reached out, pressing her palm against Damien's. His appearance hadn't changed a bit. Yes, Paige, I'm back. Seeing the tears welling in her eyes, Damien's guilt flared. He offered her a small, rueful smile. I've been gone far too long. A few hot tears escaped down Paige's cheeks. Her voice wobbled between anger and relief. I would never just abandon my best girl. She forced a weak smile. And you still owe me a dance. Damien's throat tightened. I remember our promise, but we can't turn back time. Paige gave a tiny nod, regret flickering in her eyes. I know. I'm sorry. I can't change the past, but I'm here now. Gently, Damien brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice soft and comforting. That's all I've ever wanted. On the other side of the hallway, Sharon lingered by the door, quietly smiling at the reunion. Satisfied that her aunt was safe and happy, she gently closed the door behind her, leaving Paige and Damien to share this long-awaited moment in peace. Although time cannot be reversed, for Aunt Peggy, now in her later years, meeting the man she'd longed for has become a dream fulfilled. Damien sat at her bedside, sharing the thoughts and feelings he'd carried for decades. He spoke of memories both joyous and painful, of long nights spent wondering what life might have been like together. Peggy listened, her soft eyes reflecting a lifetime of hope and regret. At last, her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted into sleep. Damien rose quietly, not wanting to disturb her rest. He paused in the dimly lit hallway, his heart heavy with emotion. He had assumed Peggy, like Howard, had passed away long ago. Never had he imagined he would find her alive, sound of mind, and willing to speak so candidly of the years they'd missed. He wanted nothing more than to make amends, to lead her in a waltz under a moonlit sky, to wipe away each sorrow etched into her smile. But time once gone cannot be reclaimed, and Peggy's frail body could no longer dance as it once did. Leaning against the cool wall, Damien felt a deep, aching helplessness. He inhaled her familiar scent, lavender and old paper, and let it steady him. Though he could not change the past, he vowed to honor what remained of their shared time. Tomorrow, he would bring her fresh flowers and the music she adored. He would keep telling her stories, offering laughter where there had been loss, and proving that love, even belated, can still bring light to life's final chapters. Chapter 144, You're Too Weak. Damien had always done what he believed was right. From the day he was born, his every decision served his country and honored the name he carried. Yet the cost of that conviction weighed heavily on him. Peggy, the woman he loved, had spent her life longing for him, her heart tethered to a promise he couldn't fully keep. No matter how many battles he fought or victories he won, he couldn't shake the guilt that shadowed him. Now, standing on the threshold of the villa, Damien felt adrift. The organization Peggy had founded, S-Shield, needed him. The world needed him. He owed them everything he still had, his strength, his loyalty, his very life. But first, he had to reclaim the power he'd lost. Decades beneath the ice had dulled his edge. Waking up in this new age had only underscored how rusty he was. As he headed for the door, Sharon Carter, Peggy's niece, heard his footsteps and slipped in beside him. "Damien, are you heading out again?" He paused and looked at her. Her concern was genuine, but he didn't have the heart to explain everything right then. "Yeah," he said softly. He hesitated. "I'm not really up for company today." Sharon studied him for a moment, then gave him a small, understanding nod. "Okay, just promise me one thing. Next time you come back, you'll tell me why you've chosen this path, why you're still fighting." He managed a faint smile. "I promise." With that, Damien stepped out into the crisp morning air. Every muscle in his body ached for action, training, rebuilding, honing himself into the soldier the world still needed. And maybe along the way, he'd find a way to pay back the debt he owed Peggy. Because no matter how weak he felt now, he refused to give up. Not on his country, not on S.H.I.E.L.D., and certainly not on the woman who had waited a lifetime for him. Damien could hardly believe only a few days had passed before he ran into Sharon Carter again. She was the very person Nick Fury had sent to help him get up to speed with the 21st century. The realization that Fury himself had arranged their meetings left Damien momentarily speechless. But he readily accepted Sharon's guidance, especially once she filled him in on Paige's unfinished business. He volunteered on the spot to pick up where Paige left off. In just over a week, Damien absorbed more about modern New York's skyline, its ever-evolving social scene, and the larger-than-life personalities who roamed its streets. But the more he encountered Tony Stark, the less impressed he became. Howard Stark's air struck Damien as vain and reckless, a man who thrived on spectacle rather than true heroism. One afternoon, Damien settled into a small cafe beneath Stark Tower, savoring a quiet black coffee. Mid-sip, he glanced up through the window and nearly choked. A glint of red and gold shot past him in the sky. "I hide away in my iron bucket all day, too scared to mingle," he muttered under his breath, a slight sneer at the edge of his tone. Iron Bucket Man seems a more accurate name than Iron Man. Damien leaned forward on the table, confident that at the dozens of meters separating them, his quip would go unheard by the armored flyer above. Yet the grin he couldn't suppress spoke volumes about his growing impatience with Stark's brand of hero. Damien squinted up at the sky, only to see Tony Stark hovering directly above him, the repulsors in his boots casting a soft glow against the darkening clouds. Tony tilted his head, amusement and a hint of contempt dancing in his eyes. "I get that you're an old-timer who doesn't appreciate real innovation," Tony called down, voice echoing through the night air. "But I never expected you to be such a clueless frog in a well." Damien's jaw clenched. He folded his arms over his chest and replied with a low, cutting edge to his tone. "You want respect? Earn it. Don't think I'm going to bow just because you built yourself a fancy flying tin can." Tony flicked a smirk. "Did I hit a nerve? Was that so wrong?" Damien spat the words out. "Every day you ID behind that steel suit, strutting around like a peacock. What are you so afraid of? Letting people see the man behind the mask." The smirk vanished from Tony's face, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He drifted a few feet lower, hovering level with Damien now. "Overreacting much?" Damien met his gaze. "Maybe, but I'm not the one who needs a giant metal shell just to prove they matter." Tony folded his arms and studied Damien as if weighing his worth. Then, with a dismissive nod, he angled his palms downward and shot a pair of controlled thrusts that lifted him out of Damien's reach. In the wan glow of the city lights, he called back, "Someday, you'll see it's not the suit that makes the hero. Try not to get left behind." As Tony rocketed upward and vanished into the clouds, Damien stood alone on the rooftop, chest heaving. The hum of Stark's jets faded into the distance, leaving only the rattling pulse of his own heartbeat and the unspoken challenge that now hovered between them. "Heh, looks like I struck a nerve," Tony taunted, his voice crackling through the helmet speakers. Steve opened his arms in a placating gesture. "Come on, Tony." Before he could finish, an armored gauntlet shot out, seized him by the waist, and sent him rocketing skyward. In midair, Steve twisted free, executed a controlled flip, and crashed onto an empty rooftop. He sprang to his feet, shield at the ready, and looked up to see Iron Man hovering above. "You love to accuse me of relying on my armor," Tony said, voice cool under the whir of servos. "But let's be honest. Before you got injected with that super soldier serum, you were just another guy in Brooklyn. After the serum, you became a legend, someone else's experiment. My suits? Every piece, every circuit, every line of code is mine. It's pure Stark ingenuity, baby. No shortcuts, no borrowed power." Tony hovered in the air, his armor's repulsors humming beneath him as he looked down at Steve Rogers. "Let's be clear," he said, voice cold. "All your strength doesn't come from you. It comes from everyone else's ingenuity." Steve crossed his arms. "And what makes you think I lean on external forces?" "I risked my life to earn this power," Tony shot back. "You'd know all about earning power the hard way, right?" Steve's eyes narrowed. "Physical strength and technological firepower aren't the same. I used to admire you, the guy who'd die for his country. Now I see you're just an arrogant hypocrite, blind to your own weaknesses." Tony's face hardened. "Save it." With that, he flipped midair and rocketed off, leaving Steve standing alone on the rooftop. As the whine of Stark's engines faded, Steve replayed Tony's parting words in his head. "You're blind to your own weakness." Was that true? He'd pushed himself harder than anyone else could imagine. Had he really been deluding himself about his limits? Steve tightened his fist, determined to find the answer within himself. Damien's body defied all limits. Conventional bullets barely left a scratch, and any wound, no matter how deep, closed itself instantly without so much as a painkiller. His superhuman strength and inexhaustible endurance meant he could spar for hours on end without ever slowing down. When he really pushed himself, he could sprint 26 meters in a single second and lift over 2 tons with ease. A dozen well-trained soldiers faced off against him unarmed and fell like bowling pins. Armed with only a shield, he could barrel through 100 opponents in under a minute, their rifles and bayonets shattering like twigs. Decades have passed since Damien first discovered his gifts, and the world around him has only grown softer. As modern life grew more comfortable, ordinary people's physiques declined, making superhumans like him even more extraordinary by comparison. In this era of peace and convenience, he stands unmatched, stronger, faster, and tougher than anyone on Earth. Even Tony Stark, Howard's brilliant son, hailed by many as the pinnacle of human ingenuity, would pale in comparison to Damien's raw power. Chapter 145. Tony picks up the hammer. Steve Rogers wanted nothing more than to corner Tony and pick up their debate where they'd left off. But by the time he was back on his feet, Tony had already slipped away. Steve could only suppress his irritation for now. After all, he'd just woken up. His strength wasn't fully back, and he didn't even have his shield on hand. The next time they met, he vowed he would school Tony in the fine art of respecting your elders and looking out for the younger crowd. Spotting a long run of stairs, he opted to skip the elevator and head down on foot. Meanwhile, Tony's walk home cleared his mind. What Steve had said hit home. He didn't need to carry everyone else's judgments. In his own time, Steve Rogers had lived with super soldier enhancements and all the cutting-edge tech of the day. He wasn't invincible, but he could hold his head high. That unshakable pride was exactly who Steve was. Tony understood that mindset all too well. He'd been proud and arrogant in the past, too, and just like that, his mood was completely restored. Damien had never fully appreciated just how small he was, how insignificant human concerns could seem, until he glimpsed the true scale of the cosmos. Only when he understood that there was always another sky above the one you'd just discovered did his own pride begin to fade. Steve Rogers was the same. He'd held on to his stubborn sense of duty and superiority until confronted with something completely beyond his experience. Damien knew Tony Stark could have eased Steve into that realization long ago, could have shown him the fragile state of humanity and coaxed him to let go of his arrogance. But Tony had been too impatient, too eager to dive back into his work. Now, Damien watched from the shadows as Captain America awoke and found himself face to face with Tony. He couldn't catch every word of their terse exchange, but Tony's restless gestures, tossing his hands, shifting his weight, made it clear that Steve's first impression was chilly. Tony's brashness had softened with time. He was more measured now, more likely to open a dialogue than to wage a ego-driven war. Even so, neither man was inclined to extend friendship on first meeting. What mattered was that the tension between them could be eased. If they could simply talk, really talk, that would be a start. Both Steve and Tony were proud, both accustomed to taking command, and neither would yield easily. As Damien studied their standoff, he couldn't help but think of the Winter Soldier and all the delicate balances yet to be resolved. Tony's style and strength had changed since last Damien saw him. Damien couldn't shake the question. If Tony ever discovered that Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, was the one who killed his parents, would he snap? There's a saying, you can't lead someone toward compassion until they've known suffering firsthand. So Damien remained an observer. If Tony chose to spare Bucky, it would be Tony's mercy. If he chose vengeance, Damien wouldn't interfere. With Captain America now awake, it was already late spring 2011. At most 3 months remained before Thor was due to arrive on Earth, what some called the Blue Star, and Damien knew he couldn't afford any missteps. The destroyer's power was formidable, and if it struck Tony, Damien's most valuable asset might be lost. Although Iron Man's armor had proven strong enough to clash head-on with Loki, it had fared poorly against the destroyer in Odin's vault. Tony's combat capabilities still needed work. Resigned to wait, Damien dove into his video games, partly to distract himself, partly because it was an easy way to keep track of Tony's departures. The roar of his suit's thrusters tearing through the upper atmosphere was unmistakable. 2 weeks passed. By early June, an unusually brutal summer heat had settled in, an ominous backdrop for the challenges ahead. Stark Industries was holding its annual technology exhibition as usual, but that same night, out in the New Mexico desert, the sky suddenly darkened. 2 young women, who'd been following an elderly man named Damien, watched in stunned silence as an unexpected storm churned above them, crackling with raw energy. Back in New York City, Tony Stark had just settled in for the evening, savoring a glass of bourbon after a long day. His personal AA, Jarvis, broke the quiet with an alert. "Sir, you may want to see this." Tony set his drink aside and swiveled toward the holoscreen. "What is it, Jarvis?" "There's an unforecast storm forming over our southwestern test range," Jarvis replied. "Satellite feeds show clear skies until moments ago, then this cell appeared out of nowhere. A focused beam of light followed shortly thereafter." As the live imagery played out before him, Tony's eyes shone with excitement. "So it's finally happening," he muttered. "And I've been waiting for this." Without another word, he activated his armor. 30 seconds later, Iron Man rocketed into the night, speeding toward New Mexico. But by the time he broke through the turbulent clouds, the storm had vanished, and whatever had called it forth was nowhere in sight. "Jarvis, initiate reconnaissance over New Mexico and expand surveillance to all surrounding cities. Track every vehicle and individual crossing the state line for the next 30 minutes, then report back immediately." Tony Stark drifted down to the ground near the strange imprint, a circle of arcane runes scorched into the desert floor. He stared at the symbols for a long moment, then tapped his gauntlet. "Cosmic Translator online," he murmured, but the device sputtered and went silent. Never before had even his most advanced universal translator failed him so completely. He frowned. If anyone could make sense of these runes, it would be Professor Damien. Tony bit his lip. "Do I really need to call for backup on a little alien graffiti?" he muttered to himself. Damien had assured him that he could handle anything, which meant this threat probably wasn't insurmountable. After pacing in a small circle and weighing his pride against pragmatism, Tony squared his shoulders. "All right," he decided. "I'll see what I can do on my own. If things go south, I'll ping Damien." With that, he extended both hands toward the glowing symbols, energy crackling along his palms as he prepared to decode and confront whatever lay hidden in those runes. Damien hovered in place as the sky suddenly blazed with light. A second beam shot down to Earth with a thunderous boom. This time, Jarvis didn't have to warn him. Damien saw it for himself. "It looks like our uninvited guest isn't alone," he muttered. He rocketed toward the impact site, just a few kilometers away. Moments later, he arrived, only to find an enormous hammer, its head buried deep in the soil. Damien held his position 100 meters above the crater. "Jarvis," he called, Run a life sign scan around the hammer. Exclude reptiles, lizards, scorpions, anything like that. A beat of silence. Then Jarvis replied, no life forms matching humanoid parameters detected within 2,000 meters. Damien frowned at the silent landscape. The hammer's weight must have been immense. Its impact had shaken the ground. He dropped his altitude, eyeing the legendary weapon. After a moment's hesitation, he reached out in his armored gauntlet, wrapped his fingers around the hammer's haft, and lifted. The air around him crackled as the hammer came free of the earth, and Damien steadied himself, ready for whatever came next. Tony lifted the hammer with effortless strength. The moment he wrapped his fingers around the handle, a sudden surge of energy pulsed through him, an unfamiliar power flowing from the metal straight into his body. Alarmed, Tony yanked his hand away and flung the hammer as far from himself as he could. From a ledge above, Damien watched in stunned silence. His eyes widened at the sight of Tony's frightened retreat. Chapter 146, 2 Ways to Lift a Hammer. Damien recalled the ancient curse Odin had laid upon Mjolnir. Only someone pure of heart, brimming with unbreakable justice and profound love, could wield the hammer. Anyone else might attempt to force it free through sheer brute strength, but if they were powerful enough for that, they'd have no need for Thor's weapon in the first place. Tony's physical might had grown tremendously, yet it clearly still fell short of breaking Odin's enchantment. His only hope was worthiness. Judging by Tony's unwavering dedication to the greater good, his dream of lifting all humanity into an interstellar age, it made perfect sense that the hammer should answer his call. As Tony caught sight of the hammer spinning back toward him, a familiar surge of power crackled through his armor. The connection felt organic, as if the weapon were a third limb of his body. He let out a sharp breath, startled by how natural it felt, and by how deeply that realization unsettled him. "Jarvis," Tony said, voice tight, "patch me through to Damien. Something's happening. I don't understand what's going on with me." The AI's calm tone filled his helmet. Despite Jarvis's composure, Tony's pulse raced. He needed answers immediately, and he needed Damien's help. Yes! Jarvis didn't understand exactly what had just happened to his employer's body, but he sensed Tony's panic, and that was enough. He wasted no time dialing Damien's number. Within 5 seconds, Damien picked up. "Damien, I need your help," Jarvis said, voice taut. "Tony's vitals just spiked off the charts. Run a full scan, see if there's anything medically wrong." "On my way," Damien replied. Then, eyes flicking across his console readouts, he spotted the anomaly. "Jarvis, what object did he just lift?" Jarvis cleared his digital throat. "It appears he picked up Mjolnir, Thor's hammer." Damien's eyebrows shot up. "You mean the legendary weapon from Norse myth?" "Exactly," Jarvis confirmed. "Only those deemed worthy can lift it, and he moved it, so he's channeling the power of the Thunder God right now. His physiology is reacting to ancient Asgardian enchantments." "Understood," Damien said calmly. "Sir," he addressed Tony's comm, "take a deep breath. The strange sensations you're feeling aren't a suit malfunction. They're magic. The easiest fix is to return the hammer." Tony's voice trembled. "Return it? How? I can't exactly hand it back to Thor." "Jarvis, please instruct Mr. Stark to activate Mjolnir's return enchantment," Damien said. "Simply willing it to fly home will sever the connection." "I'll do it now," Jarvis replied. "Tony, concentrate. Will it back to Thor." There was a faint crackle of energy, and then Mjolnir lifted from Tony's grasp in a flash of blue lightning. It arced high into the sky and vanished. "Vitals normalizing," Jarvis reported. "Thank you, Damien." "No problem," Damien said, logging off. He shook his head in amusement. Only in this world would an afternoon call involve rescuing someone from wielding a god's hammer. Damien lingered in the courtyard as Tony tapped away at his tablet. "I'll swing by your manor later to talk," Tony said without looking up. "How are you planning to summon it?" Damien asked, raising an eyebrow. Tony finally glanced at him, amused. "Summon? There's no ritual involved. If you don't call it, you just go and pick it up. Won't hurt you." Damien frowned. "You actually know how to recall Mjolnir? And you've got another method?" Tony grinned. "Trust me, it's perfectly safe. We can worry about that alien once I've wrapped my head around Thor's hammer." Without another word, Tony launched himself into the sky. Damien watched the streak of Stark Tech propulsion vanish over the horizon and reappear moments later in the remote canyons of Mexico. In one smooth motion, Tony retrieved Mjolnir, then angled his flight path back toward Stark Manor. From the terrace, Damien observed as Tony effortlessly hoisted the hammer. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Thor's legendary weapon was supposed to be lost in the wilderness, and now here it was in Tony's grip. Somewhere out there, the god of thunder must be scouring the realm for it. 10 minutes later, Tony touched down in the manor's courtyard, Mjolnir balanced casually on his forearm. Tony winked. "Ready to deal with that alien?" Damien smirked. "After you figure out everything this hammer can do." Damien paused in the doorway, holding Thor's hammer in one hand. "Tony, I just realized something," he said. "Right before the hammer crashed down, I saw a beam of light streak through the sky." Tony Stark stepped into the hall, glanced at the heavy axe-like handle, then back at Damien with a smirk. "Still connecting the dots, huh? Good to see that genius brain hasn't gone soft." He nodded toward the hammer. "Only one guy travels like that. Thor, the god of thunder." He dropped his weapon. Damien let out a long breath and cracked a grin. "I was hoping for an alien invasion, thought we might get to test the new defense grid. Instead, it was Thor." Tony's eyes cooled. The thrill of an extraterrestrial threat faded at the mention of Asgard's mightiest warrior. He gently set Mjolnir on the floor. "If you can lift it," he said in a flat tone, "why not give it a whirl yourself?" Damien knelt beside the hammer, turning it over. "They say anyone worthy can channel the power of a god through it," he mused. "That'd be one hell of a strength boost." Tony shrugged, leaning against the wall. "Go on, see if you're worthy of the thunder god's blessing." Damien looked up, genuinely surprised by Tony's casual offer. "I didn't expect you to be so cool with it." Tony rolled his eyes, but didn't take the hammer back. "Hey, I want to see if you've actually got what it takes." In the cavernous workshop, lit by the steady glow of arc reactors and strewn with prototype armor pieces, Damien stood before Mjolnir, its runes pulsing faintly. He folded his arms and looked up at Tony. "Honestly, I've already tapped into the power of the void, far deeper and more mysterious than Thor's thunder. I don't need Mjolnir's strength." Tony sipped his espresso without so much as a flicker of surprise. "Don't forget, it's still Thor's weapon. He'll come back for it sooner or later, and when he does, I'll hand it right over." Damien smirked. "I see you've learned how to flatter me without even opening your mouth." "Flattery?" Tony set down his cup and leaned against the workbench. "I'm not looking to gain anything here." Damien laughed, shaking his head. "Must be spending too much time with Renoli and the others. They sing your praises like you're the actual void god, lapping up every little thing you do." He waved a hand dismissively. "But in all seriousness, you've already done more than enough for me." Tony's lips curved into a genuine grin. "Well, it's good to know you acknowledge it, especially since it's your openness that let you lift Mjolnir in the first place." Damien's eyes sparkled with amusement. "I'll take that as the highest compliment I've heard all day." Damien leaned against the doorway, eyebrows raised. "So there are conditions for lifting Mjolnir?" Tony Stark, who'd been lounging on the couch, sat up at once. "This is Odin's own weapon," he said, voice tinged with awe. "Not just anyone can even touch it." He waved his hand toward the hammer. "You have to be worthy, pure of heart." Damien smirked. "You really think I'm worthy?" Tony's interest flared. Only one way to find out. Without a second thought, Damien strode over and grasped Mjolnir's handle. He lifted as if testing its weight, but the hammer remained rooted to the floor. "Don't tell me you're joking with me," he said with a half grin. "Be honest, am I wasting my time here?" Tony chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not about muscle. I rely on sheer force. You need virtue." Damien's gaze darkened. His right hand shimmered with purple void energy, tendrils of power coiling around his forearm. With a decisive pull, he summoned that power through his arm, and Mjolnir rose smoothly into his hand, hovering as if aiding an old friend. He turned the hammer over in his grip, expression cool. "Not so hard, was it?" Tony stared, astonishment etched across his face as Damien held the hammer effortlessly. Finally, he managed. "Incredible. I've never seen anyone do that." "It looks like the full chapter text wasn't included. Could you please paste the section you'd like me to rewrite?" "Once I have the content, I'll polish it into smooth, idiomatic English, rename Harvey to Damien, and ensure he's clearly male." Chapter 147. broken things. Damien studied Tony Stark's easy confidence with a faint smile. There's a curse on Mjolnir, he began, but I've worked out a way to nullify it. Once I do, lifting the hammer by sheer force won't be a problem, but you'll soon learn just how impossible it is to raise Thor's weapon without its consent. Tony arched an eyebrow. He'd seen Damien channel Kassadin's void template and understood the depths of his arcane knowledge. Disrupting Odin's enchantment wasn't a walk in the park, but it wasn't beyond Damien's skill set. All right, Tony said, but tell me this, why has the hammer turned against Thor? Damien's expression grew serious. Saul holds the key to that answer. You'll find out more when you speak to her in a few days. Tony's face hardened. I'm here to retrieve the hammer. If you want it back in Thor's hands, you'd better give me something concrete, intelligence, a timeline, anything. Otherwise, finding Thor won't be so easy. Damien nodded and turned away thoughtfully. I'll get a message to Saul by tomorrow. She'll fill you in on every detail. Tony gave him a curt nod in return. Good. I'll be ready. Damien wasn't the least bit worried about Thor. For one thing, he was confident in his own strength. And Tony had made it clear that God King Odin, the patron saint of Blue Star, would never let his son threaten their world. As the god of thunder and another of Blue Star's celestial guardians, Thor posed no real danger. All right, I'm heading back, Damien said, setting the enchanted hammer gently on the table. Next time you run into trouble, don't panic, Tony warned. He leaned forward, eyes earnest. Even if Mjolnir messes with you, you're tougher than you think. Just don't die. We've got plenty of ways to bring you back. Damien gave a half smile. Satisfied that Tony was calm, he rose and reached into the air. A dark, shimmering portal unfolded before them, its edges crackling with otherworldly energy. He hesitated for a moment, then said, I've never opened a void gate like this before. No experience whatsoever. Tony scratched the back of his head, looking sheepish. He hated admitting gaps in his knowledge, but whenever he ran into a problem he couldn't solve, he knew exactly whom to call. Damien was full of enigmas and answers. Damien caught Tony's glance, offered a reassuring nod, and stepped into the swirling rift without another word. Damien hadn't dropped anything too alarming when he spoke, just a bit of information, nothing that caused any real trouble. With that, he stepped into the dark void portal and disappeared on his way home. Once the portal winked out, Tony picked up Mjolnir again, turning it over in his hands. He shut his eyes and concentrated, trying to feel the faint tug of that unseen third arm that the hammer is said to lend its wielder. The sensation was unmistakable, an almost spiritual connection. That's when Pepper appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in a smart, flowing skirt and blouse. Tony, she called, didn't I just hear Damien? Where did he go? Tony looked up and realized why she was so well turned out. She'd known Damien was coming and changed clothes to make a good impression. He had to head back, Tony said. Something came up. Pepper paused on the landing, frowning. Something came up? What was it? Tony shrugged. He turned his gaze back to the hammer. He wanted us to do another test. Pepper's curiosity got the better of her. She stepped into the center of the hall, reached out, and lifted Mjolnir as if it weighed nothing. The hammer floated effortlessly in her hand, its runes glowing faintly. Tony's heart skipped a beat. He remembered Damien's last words. If we wanted proof, this would be it. And now, watching Pepper wield the legendary hammer, Tony realized just how much Damien had, perhaps intentionally, obscured. If Pepper could lift Mjolnir, then everything they thought they knew was suddenly in question. Pepper had always evolved more slowly than the others, but in the 2.5 years since he joined the Void, he'd already undergone 90 evolutions. His strength and endurance now far outpaced those of any normal human. One afternoon, Tony Stark slid a strange-looking hammer onto the table in front of him. Hey, Pepper, why don't you give this a lift? Pepper glanced at the unassuming chunk of metal. Thor's hammer? You want me to pick up this thing? Tony offered a knowing grin. I know it looks like junk, but Damien swears it's the real Mjolnir. Pepper scoffed. Damien said it? Well, Damien's not one to spread tall tales. If he believes it's Thor's hammer, I'm willing to take his word. He reached out, clicked his fingers around the leather-wrapped handle, and braced himself. At first, the hammer felt impossibly heavy, yet somehow stubbornly immobile. Pepper strained, digging every ounce of his enhanced power into the effort, but Mjolnir refused to budge. It was the weight of myth made manifest, far heavier than it looked, and utterly unmoved by anything but its true master. Pepper had upgraded her armor countless times. Surely, if sheer muscle and tech could lift any heavy object, she should be able to hoist Mjolnir. Still, she crossed her arms and shook her head. I don't buy it. With that, she set aside her one-handed grip, took the hammer's handle in both gauntleted hands, and poured every ounce of strength into the effort. The workshop floor cracked beneath her power, but the enchanted hammer refused to budge. Tony watched quietly, brow furrowed. Damien had warned him. Mjolnir's enchantment couldn't be overcome by force alone. Pepper's attempt only proved Damien right and revealed just how mysterious his abilities truly were. When she finally stepped back, chest heaving, Pepper glared at Tony. Why can you pick it up, but I can't? She tried again and again, each effort ending in failure. Finally, Tony set down his tools and offered an explanation. There are really only two ways for someone like Damien to lift Mjolnir. Pepper's frustration turned into skepticism. And what are those? Tony smiled, gently brushing a speck of dust from the workbench. First, you need the physical strength, but that's just half the equation. More importantly, you need a heart worthy of its power. Mjolnir judges the purity of one's purpose. Pepper paused, her disappointment giving way to curiosity. A heart worthy of its power. So how exactly do you measure a worthy heart? Tony met her gaze, eyes thoughtful. That's the real test. A soul's commitment to justice, selflessness, and courage. Only when all those are true does the hammer respond. Pepper nodded slowly, the gears in her mind already turning. Lifting Mjolnir might take more than raw strength. It would demand the kind of integrity and resolve that couldn't be built in a lab. I haven't the foggiest, Damien admitted, spreading his hands in mock surrender. Let's drop this metaphysical rabbit hole before I short-circuit my own brain. Pepper raised an eyebrow. But Damien, by your own timeline, the god of thunder should be crashing down here in a few days, he groaned. Meaning, I get to spend the next few days cooped up in stark armor. Seriously, Pepper shook her head. How could you forget? Look, I'm buried under deadlines, Damien muttered, more to himself than to her. I barely have time to grease the gears on this tin can, let alone track down a hammer-wielding demigod. Thank goodness I reminded you, Pepper said, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Otherwise, you'd just let Thor turn up unannounced, and... Damien shot her a wry look. Blue Star had been his one refuge from the chaos of the workshop, a place he could actually breathe. And now, because he'd poked around into Asgardian affairs and retrieved Thor's hammer, he'd have to suit up 24/7, just in case his thunderous majesty showed up on his doorstep. He sighed, tapped a few final keys, and hit send on the third update. Chapter 148, I Am Thor, God of Thunder. Meanwhile, in the deserts of New Mexico, Agent Phil Coulson got his orders and raced west overnight. S-Shield's sensors had picked up a massive surge of unknown energy, and by dawn he stood before its aftermath, a deep crater blasted into the hard-packed earth and etched into the dirt beside it, a strange runic symbol glowing faintly. Whatever had struck here had to be incredibly heavy and fiercely powerful. Thankfully, the site lay in a remote wilderness. Had it been any closer to civilization, the blast would have cost lives. Coulson wasted no time. He ordered teams to establish a secure perimeter around both the crater and the rune. With the unprecedented energy spike they detected, it was clear this wasn't a simple meteorite or geological anomaly. Something, or someone, had brought supernatural force to bear. Of course, it could still be the handiwork of an extreme cult ritual rather than genuine magic, but that distinction would require thorough laboratory analysis and expert consultation. No sooner had the security teams finished sealing off the area than Coulson's earpiece crackled to life. "Sir, Tony Stark is on comms," the voice reported. Coulson acknowledged it and listened as Stark explained that he'd arrived at the site roughly 30 minutes after that energy beam first lit up the night sky. Now, with the scene secured, they would finally be able to piece together what and who had unleashed such power in the New Mexico desert. When Tony Stark reappeared on the perimeter of the manor, S-Shield's analysts zeroed in on the satellite footage. What they saw confirmed their worst suspicions. Stark was clutching something that looked exactly like the hammer they'd been guarding. In other words, he'd taken it. That single fact put S.H.I.E.L.D. in a bind. If an ordinary civilian had slipped away with the hammer, the agency could pressure, negotiate, or even legally compel its return. But persuading Tony Stark, genius billionaire and CEO extraordinaire, to hand over one of his own prized possessions? That was a tall order. With time running out, Agent Phil Coulson decided to contain the situation as best he could. Once Stark was involved, it wasn't just a security breach, it was a paranormal event, and paranormal events demanded total secrecy. The satellite images also showed a handful of witnesses near the manor last night. Coulson's immediate priority: round up those onlookers and destroy any evidence before rumors hit the internet and ignited a media firestorm. Meanwhile, in the golden halls of Asgard, Heimdall, the ever-vigilant gatekeeper of the Bifrost, stared in stunned disbelief. Thor's hammer, cursed by Odin himself, had been lifted not by Thor or Hela, but by two mortals on Midgard. How could such a thing be mere coincidence? Had Odin woven a deeper design into his curse, ensuring that only the worthy, now twice over, might claim Mjolnir? Heimdall dared not voice the question aloud. He kept his doubts to himself, watching and waiting. By morning, Thor found himself waking in a human hospital. His first thought was Heimdall. "Heimdall," he rasped, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "Where are you? Send me back!" He jumped to his feet, panic flaring in his eyes. As the god of thunder, he'd never been ignored, yet now his calls for Heimdall echoed unanswered down the sterile corridor. Stripped of his hammer and cast to this unfamiliar world, Thor felt the firmament shift beneath him. His shouts, laced with divine urgency, soon drew a small crowd of nurses and doctors who scrambled in alarm at the spectacle of the trembling, disheveled man in the hospital gown. What he'd expected, an immediate return to Asgard, seemed farther away than ever. Damien slipped out of the hospital under the cover of early morning light, his pale gown flapping around him like a cape. His heart pounded with a single urgent mission: recover his hammer, Mjolnir, and find a way back to Asgard. He hurtled onto the sidewalk, eyes darting side to side, as if expecting the enchanted pawn to appear at any moment. From a black Honda waiting at the light nearby, Daisy Louise's breath caught in her throat. "Jane, isn't that the guy we hit last night?" she asked, voice trembling. The tall, broad-shouldered stranger in the hospital robes looked exactly like the man who had miraculously escaped unscathed after their accident. "How did he get discharged so fast?" Jane Foster replied, slamming the car into park. Both women vaulted out, concern etched on their faces as they hurried across the street. Damien came to a stop just steps from them, chest heaving, eyes bright with feverish resolve. Not a stitch of injury marked him, no casts, no bruises, nothing to show he'd ever even been involved in a wreck. "Sir, are you all right?" Jane called, reaching out to steady him. She touched his arm gently, but he brushed past her hand, scanning the pavement as though expecting something to materialize beneath his feet. "My hammer," Damien murmured, voice low and urgent. "Where is Mjolnir? I must return it to me, and return home." Jane exchanged a wary look with Daisy. Last night this man had ranted about Odin, giants in the Rainbow Bridge. Now here he stood, alive and seemingly unhurt, lost in a world he claimed wasn't his own. Jane took a calming breath. "Okay," she said, "let's figure this out, together." Chapter 1. A Second Encounter. Damien paused on the sidewalk the moment he heard her voice. "I'm sure I've seen you before." He turned to face a young woman with honey-blonde hair and concerned green eyes. A distant memory flickered through his mind. "Of course you have," he said quietly. "You were the ones who nearly ran me down with your car last night." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She stumbled through an apology. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, glancing at her companion. "I'm Daisy Louise." The second woman, dark-haired and composed, offered a small, professional smile. "Jane Foster," she added, "we feel terrible about what happened and want to make it right." Damien crossed his arms, studying them both. He ran a hand through his sunlit blonde hair and gave a wry half-smile. "Damien Carter," he introduced himself. Then, arching an eyebrow, he teased, "Are you sure this isn't some cruel joke, or that you two haven't lost your minds?" Daisy's lips twitched in irritation. "I really don't have the patience for your sarcasm," she shot back, voice trembling between embarrassment and frustration. Jane placed a calming hand on Daisy's arm. Turning back to Damien, Jane softened her tone. Well, I am sincerely sorry. It was an accident, but that's no excuse. You were hurt. Damien let out a low chuckle, exhaling the tension. I'm okay, he said, wincing a little as he stretched his wrist where it had been bruised. Honestly. Jane's curiosity got the better of her. She noticed, as he slid his jacket sleeve back into place, an engraved crest on his cufflink, a small, stylized phoenix she'd seen once on the invitations to a high-society gala downtown. She leaned in slightly. That emblem, you're with the Carter Foundation, aren't you? You organize those charity auctions? Damien nodded, a flicker of surprise on his features. You know of them? Jane's eyes brightened. Just by reputation. You always seem to bring a room to life, your energy, your enthusiasm. She studied him with genuine interest. You don't look like someone who needs an apology, though. Not in the least. Daisy exhaled, finally letting some of her nerves slip away. If you really don't want anything, then maybe you'd let us buy you coffee? You know, a small gesture of goodwill? Damien's blue eyes twinkled in the glow of the streetlight. He offered a relaxed half-bow. Coffee sounds perfect. As they stepped toward the nearby cafe, Daisy and Jane exchanged relieved smiles. Damien fell into step beside them, each party silently wondering how much a single collision could change their nights and perhaps their lives. Jane shot Daisy an exasperated look before turning to Saul. If there's anything you need, we'll help however we can. Just night, the sensors had picked up a surge of unusually potent energy. A storm had roared in minutes later, and at its heart, a man had appeared, babbling incoherently about gods, legends, and mythic artifacts. He'd even uttered the words, Rainbow Bridge, which sent Dr. Eric racing to the library to research and confirm the Norse connection. He's freezing, Saul pointed out. He needs clothes. Damien, the stranger, nodded gratefully and lifted his right hand, as if to call forth some magical armor. When nothing happened, he looked embarrassed. The hospital gown he wore was ill-fitting, and he shifted awkwardly on his feet. Jane caught Saul make a barely perceptible gesture, something almost imperceptible, but strange enough to convince her that helping this man would be worth it. If she could earn his trust, perhaps she could unravel the secrets he carried. All right, Damien said, voice low. I'll go with you. He glanced down at his gown and hurried after Jane as she strode toward the exit. Behind them, Dr. Eric waved his tablet enthusiastically. I'll keep digging into Bifrost and see what else I can uncover. Jane glanced back, a determined smile tugging at her lips. Today, they would find Damien some proper clothes. And, just maybe, get one step closer to peeling back the mystery of the storm and the god who emerged from it. Chapter 149. Conversation between Tony and Thor. Tony reviewed his latest intel. There had been an incident at a New Mexico hospital where a patient calling himself Saul had bolted from his room like someone possessed. To most onlookers, he'd seem either a dangerous lunatic or an obsessive role player. But Tony held Mjolnir in his workshop, and Damien's eyewitness account left no doubt. This Saul was the real Thor. Jarvis, Tony said, tapping his console, activate every surveillance feed around that hospital. Track Thor's path and tell me his current location. Right away, sir. And once you've pinpointed him, patch me into the nearest secure terminal. I want to speak with him directly. He couldn't risk leaving the hammer lying around. S.H.I.E.L.D. agents wouldn't dare raid Stark Manor, but Thor, while Tony privately viewed him less as a mythic god and more as a vastly powerful alien life form, remained an unstoppable force. If Thor learned his hammer was in Tony's possession, he could turn up unannounced. Better to return Mjolnir now before this situation spiraled completely out of control. Yes, sir. Gathering data now. Jarvis's calm voice crackled through Damien's earpiece as he set to work. Damien had made it clear that returning Thor's hammer was now their top priority. Across New Mexico, Jarvis panned through every available surveillance feed. In less than half an hour, he had Saul's precise location, but Saul wasn't carrying a phone. Unfazed, Jarvis quietly linked into nearby cameras and motion sensors to keep tabs on him. Out in Albuquerque, Jane led Saul into her airy studio and handed him a clean shirt. Splashes of paint dotted the walls and floor. The afternoon sun streamed in through a row of tall windows. Jane's phone buzzed on a cluttered work table. Before she could even check the caller ID, the video call auto-connected. On the screen stood a man in gleaming red and gold armor, his face concealed by a golden mask. Iron Man, Tony Stark? Jane whispered, heart pounding. Though she was miles from New York, Tony Stark's reputation as Iron Man needed no introduction. More than a year had passed since the genius inventor first debuted his high-tech suit, saving lives, dismantling terrorist cells, and earning global renown in the process. Now, even a pop-up art studio in New Mexico felt the ripple of his legend. Chapter 7. Though Tony Stark had stayed out of the public eye for the past year, anyone who read newspapers, watched the nightly news, or scrolled through the internet still knew one name: Iron Man. Tony Stark. Jane Foster peered at her phone's screen in disbelief. "It's Tony Stark," she said, her voice low. Daisy, sitting beside her, frowned. The real Iron Man? What could he possibly want? Jane barely registered her friend's astonishment. She'd spent the last hour wondering if the man before her really was Thor, the Norse god of thunder. Now, if Tony Stark, billionaire genius, Avenger, celebrity, was insisting on speaking with Thor, that settled it. The man in front of her must be the genuine article. Jane rose to her feet and held out the phone. The tall figure who'd been changing into casual clothes paused, then accepted the device in one massive hand. His long hair was tied back, and though he'd ditched his armor, his presence was unmistakable. "Thor," Jane said softly, "Tony Stark is on the line for you." Thor, who'd been adjusting the sleeve of his jacket, looked down at the caller ID, then back at Jane. He cleared his throat, a faint rumble in his chest. "Yes?" he said, his voice deep and resonant. Jane stepped back as Thor brought the phone to his ear. Daisy stared, wide-eyed, as the god of thunder prepared to converse with Iron Man. A moment later, Thor's face brightened with recognition. "Iron Man?" he repeated. "This is Thor." Thor stood on the barren plain of Blue Star, his crimson cape fluttering in the cold wind. Across from him, leaning casually against a hovering Quinjet, was Iron Man himself. "Thor, god of thunder," Tony Stark began, flashing a grin beneath his helmet's seatable visor. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Thor regarded him coolly. "I'm Tony Stark, Iron Man." Tony folded his arms. "I know you've come to Blue Star, and I'm pretty sure you want Mjolnir back." Thor's eyes narrowed. Since setting foot on this planet, he'd lost all sense of his hammer's whereabouts. If he could only reclaim it, he could return to Asgard and to his father. "Of course," he said, voice taut. "My hammer is in your possession." "Right," Tony said, nodding. He tapped a few commands on a wrist display, and an address appeared in midair. "If you're serious about getting Mjolnir back, meet me here." Thor glanced at the floating coordinates, then back to the armored man. "And what do you want in exchange?" Tony shrugged. "Let's just say everything on Earth has a price." He leaned in, eyes glinting behind the visor. "So, what's yours?" "No strings attached," Tony typed. "Just come by and pick up your things. I don't want to hang on to them any longer." He froze for a moment when he saw Saul ask about conditions. Someone who knew exactly what they wanted and was willing to pay a price for it was rarely foolish. At least not as foolish as Steve. "Can I see Mjolnir first?" Saul pressed. "Snap a photo and send it over," Tony replied. Thor's image flickered on Tony's screen, but his masked face gave nothing away. Tony's weakened state made him more cautious than usual. A moment later, a single photograph arrived. There, lying on a simple wooden table, was the hammer, pristine and unmistakable. "That's it," Thor confirmed. "I'm on my way." Tony nodded to himself and ended the call. He didn't need to second-guess the reply. The photo said it all. Daisy, who'd been watching from across the room, turned to him, her eyes wide. "Wait, so that was really Thor?" "Of course. Who else would dare to call myself by that name?" Damien said with a faint, confident smile. Thor lifted his head, pride clear in his eyes. "So, this is where we part ways?" Jane, who had just confirmed Damien's true identity and realized he was about to leave, shook her head. "Not quite yet. Actually, I need your help." Damien hesitated, a flicker of awkwardness crossing his features. "You're a god. Why don't you just fly there yourself?" Daisy, who'd been convinced Damien was firmly on their side, now narrowed her eyes in suspicion. "What's going on?" Damien let out a small sigh. "Something happened. I've lost my powers, at least for the time being. And even if I still had them, I'm unfamiliar with this realm. I need someone to show me where Tony Stark said he'd rendezvous." He met their doubtful stares and pressed on, voice earnest. "Will you help me? I promise I'll make it worth your while once this is done. Jane exchanged a quick glance with Daisy, then stepped forward and offered him a reassuring smile. No repayment needed, but on the way, I'd like to learn more about you and this world you come from. What do you say? Daisy relaxed slightly, and Damien nodded gratefully. As the four of them prepared to set off, a new alliance was quietly forged, one that would carry them to whatever lay ahead. Sure. At the sound of those words, Thor's lips curved into a satisfied smile. The 5th update is now live. Please cast your vote. Chapter 150, Thor Goes to New York. Jane and Daisy first rang up Dr. Eric to let him know they were heading to New York. A little later, Jane drove Damien out to the airport. After all, there was no way they'd attempt the more than 1,000-kilometer journey by car. Besides, Damien had already agreed that if they helped him, he'd share the information they wanted. Once they arrived, Jane drew out her credit card and purchased 2 tickets, while Daisy insisted on paying for her own. It's not every day you get to visit the home of America's richest man, she said with a grin, referring to Tony Stark. Before long, the 3 of them, Jane, Daisy, and Damien, were settled in their seats on the flight to New York. Throughout the trip, Jane kept her eyes on Damien. Though he seemed intrigued and at times mildly surprised by some of the advanced Blue Star technologies they'd brought along, he never made a scene. Clearly these innovations were new to him, but he maintained a calm, measured composure. After a while, Daisy leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "So what's Tony Stark really like?" she asked. Damien paused, considering. Stark had shown no sign of hostility so far, but Damien knew better than to take that at face value. If they were going to work with or around Tony Stark, he still had plenty more to learn. Damien shrugged. "I can't recall all of Stark's exploits from childhood through adulthood." "Then let me sum up Tony Stark for you," Daisy said, twirling a finger as she ticked off each label. "World-renowned genius inventor, weapons manufacturer, America's top billionaire and financial whiz, one of New York's most eligible bachelors. He's been with several celebrity women, and a full-blown superhero. He built the steel armor and saved countless lives." Thor leaned forward, intrigued. "So, he's not a bad guy then?" Damien glanced at Daisy, knowing full well her list reflected only the public's popular image of Stark. Still, she nodded decisively. "Not at all. He really is that remarkable." A smile broke across Damien's face as relief washed over him. "That's good to know." He remembered how, during their brief talk earlier, Stark had sounded as if he already knew Damien was coming, and even knew about the weapons he carried. Damien sat in the cramped cabin, shoulders hunched. His strength had barely begun to return, and with that fragility came a gnawing lack of confidence. Yet, after spending a few hours with Thor, he was convinced the Asgardian prince meant them no harm. That realization eased some of his anxiety. Across the aisle, Jane tapped her pen against a notepad, brow furrowed. She had a dozen questions for Thor, about Asgard, about Mjolnir, even about the realm of the gods, but the plane was crowded and noisy. She didn't want to fire off a random query, only to have Thor give a casual answer, drawing unwanted stares from fellow passengers. Instead, Jane quietly sorted her thoughts, promising herself a proper, uninterrupted conversation once Thor had reclaimed his hammer. By midday, the jet touched down in Malibu. Jane, her partner Daisy, and Thor piled into an armored SUV Tony Stark had dispatched for them, and they began the winding climb to Stark Manor. Daisy pressed her nose against the tinted window, staring up at the mansion's gleaming white towers nestled into the mountainside. "What a life," she breathed. Jane glanced over, offering a wry smile. "Envy suits you." Daisy let out a soft laugh. "I've spent years buried in data, trying to predict disasters, safeguard the world. Meanwhile, some billionaire playboy just builds a castle on a cliff, no worries, infinite resources." She shook her head, half in awe, half in frustration. "If you hate the rich, you'd really hate that." Thor, driving with easy confidence, chimed in, "Mr. Stark did earn that place, though I suspect he'd gladly share his hospitality once we explain our situation." The mansion appeared in full view, its towers sparkling in the noon sun. Daisy settled back in her seat, determination in her eyes. "All right, I can't promise I won't ask Stark for a cutting-edge lab." Jane laughed. "That's the spirit. We're here to get Thor's hammer back, and maybe borrow some tech while we're at it." Damien leaned forward, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. His powers might be weak for now, but surrounded by friends like these, he felt less powerless than ever. "Can we really go in together?" Daisy asked, her tone sharp. Jane felt a surge of dread at the look Daisy gave her, but she kept her voice steady as she turned to Saul. "You're helping me, so of course you can come along." Saul's lips curved into a relaxed smile. Having seen the splendors of Asgard and befriended beings like Odin and Thor, Stark's high-tech mansion was impressive, but hardly astonishing to him. "I'll escort you to this point," he said, stopping the car before a towering iron gate. "From here on, you'll need to proceed on your own." The driver killed the engine. "This is officially the entrance to Mr. Stark's estate," he said. "Good luck, Miss Foster. Miss Louise." "Thank you," Jane replied, stepping out. Daisy nodded stiffly behind her. As the driver's car pulled away, an unexpectedly warm, masculine voice resonated from high above the gate. "Mr. Thor, Miss Foster, Miss Louise, welcome. My husband has been waiting quite some time. Please come in." With a soft hum, the gate swung open automatically. Jane exchanged a puzzled glance with Daisy. "Who's speaking?" Jane asked, her curiosity piqued. Daisy's eyes scanned the surroundings, her suspicion evident as she murmured, "I don't know, but we'd better find out." Damien, Daisy, and Thor stood before a broad corridor lined with glowing panels. A calm, modulated voice emerged from the walls. "Don't be alarmed," it said. "I'm Jarvis, an advanced AI created by Mr. Tony Stark." Daisy's eyes went wide and her jaw dropped. Tony Stark built an artificial intelligence? I knew he was a genius, but this? She shook her head in wonder. In their era, true AI was still the stuff of theory and schematics. Yet here it was, speaking to them. "Follow the light," Jarvis continued. "It will lead you to Mr. Stark." At once, the panels along the corridor brightened in sequence, forming a shimmering path. Damien stepped forward, studying the flickering glow. "Jarvis," he said, "you seem to know me quite well." Thor fell into stride beside him. "Mr. Stark is familiar with your name, but not much else." "Is that so?" the AI asked. "Where did you hear of me?" Damien offered a half-smile. "I picked up scraps here and there, old myths, obscure biographies of the Blue Star, even a few children's storybooks back home." "Fascinating," Jarvis replied. "For the rest of your story, you'll have to ask Mr. Stark in person." With that, the AI's voice faded, and the illuminated corridor stretched on before them, inviting their next step. Damien's pulse quickened as the holographic glow of JRVS blinked to life in the dim mountain cavern. The AI's calm voice carried an undercurrent of something unspoken. "If you'd simply read the files," JRVS said, "you wouldn't have guessed who I really am so quickly." Damien swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "Mr. Stark, is there something you're not telling me?" The artificial light danced on the rune-carved walls as JRS paused, as if weighing every word. "Mr. Stark asked me to assure you, as long as you refrain from taking any action without explicit permission, he will not move against you. In fact, he hopes you'll recover Mjolnir without delay." Damien's heart sank. The moment he'd stepped into this secret stronghold, every step, and now every word, had been under Tony Stark's watchful eye. He pressed his lips together, uncertain whether to be relieved or enraged. He bowed his head briefly. "Understood." Even as he spoke, Damien resolved to confront Tony face to face. There were too many questions left unanswered, and he would settle each one, no matter what it took. Chapter 151. I Can't Go Back. With no vehicles available, the three of them set off on foot, winding their way up the mountain road. After more than half an hour's trek, they finally arrived at the grand villa perched at the summit. Standing at the entrance was a man in gleaming gold and red armor. "Thor, god of thunder, welcome to Blue Star," he greeted, his tone warm and authoritative. Tony Stark offered a friendly smile to Damien and extended his hand. "Good to meet you." Damien hesitated for a heartbeat, half expecting a show of strength, then shook Tony's hand. The handshake was firm but brief, and Tony let go with a chuckle. "Now, go on, summon your hammer," Tony said. Without a moment's hesitation, Tony flicked his wrist. From somewhere within the villa, Mjolnir hurtled through the air and landed squarely in his palm. Thor's eyes widened in astonishment. He had never seen anyone but himself command the hammer's flight. With a nod, Tony handed Mjolnir back to its rightful owner, a knowing grin on his face. Thor reached out for Mjolnir just as Tony loosened his grip. The instant Thor lifted the hammer, its brutal weight yanked him forward, and he staggered, barely keeping his balance before dropping it with a heavy clang. The hammer struck the ground so hard it gouged a small crater in the concrete. Jane Foster and Daisy Whitman both gasped. Jane covered her mouth. That weight doesn't match how it looks. Did I mix him up with someone else? Tony Stark's brow knit in confusion. He looked to Damien, who'd been explaining the hammer's magic. You said anyone with a righteous heart could lift Mjolnir, that it's Thor's exclusive weapon. If that really was Thor, he'd have lifted it without effort. Are you sure he's the genuine article? Damien nodded. Right. Only someone truly worthy can pick it up as easily as breathing. If he was the real Thor, he wouldn't have broken a sweat. Thor felt the shift in Tony's demeanor, from welcoming to wary, and bristled at the unspoken doubt. Still, he squared his shoulders and offered a courteous smile. I assure you, I am Thor, son of Odin. Thor stepped up to Mjolnir and wrapped his hands around its handle, bracing himself to lift. But despite every ounce of effort, the hammer didn't so much as budge. His face drained of color in disbelief. Veins and sinews stood out on his arms as he strained with both hands. No, this can't be happening, he muttered, voice cracking. He heaved again, heart pounding, and still the hammer lay stubbornly on the ground. At last, Thor's knees gave way and he sank to the floor, shoulders sagging. Jane, watching his whole body tremble, knelt beside him. Thor, are you all right? She asked, panic in her voice. He didn't answer. The fact that Mjolnir wouldn't obey him meant his father had followed through on his threat. Odin had stripped him of his divine power and cast him down to Midgard. Without that power, he was no longer a god, just a man. Ah, father, why would you do this? Thor roared, the sound of his anguish rolling up into the stormy sky. Tony raised his gauntlet, and before Thor could even roar, a subtle energy field from the armored glove snapped his mouth shut. Caught by the sheer force, Thor stared at Tony Stark's Iron Man suit with wide, startled eyes. Easy now, Tony said, voice controlled but unyielding. Don't get excited. Thor's grip on Mjolnir tightened, then froze. You can wield it, but I cannot. No tricks, Tony replied. I can hold it, yes, but I won't keep it. If you want Mjolnir back, you'll tell me exactly what happened to you. Tony sensed Thor's astonishment in the beat of his hammer-armored fist. He knew Damien had foreseen this standoff. Damien had warned him Thor wouldn't retrieve the hammer by force, and that the only way forward was to get Thor to explain himself. After all, Mjolnir is more than a weapon, it's the very essence of Thor's power, but Stark always prefers his own inventions. Still, restoring the hammer is the right course. First, he needs the whole story. Thor's broad chest rose and fell as he fought for composure. At last he nodded, his voice low and steady. Very well, Stark, but heed this. The fate of the 9 realms depends on what I reveal. Let go once you've calmed down. Tony Stark didn't release his grip at first when he caught sight of Damien's sudden appearance. He kept him pinned, voice serious. Only after Damien gave him a firm, repeated nod did Tony finally unclench his hand. Tony Stark, who are you? Damien asked, drawing a sharp breath as he freed his mouth. Didn't I already introduce myself? Tony replied coolly. I'm Iron Man, Tony Stark. As he spoke, Tony couldn't shake the thought of how he'd muzzled Damien so forcefully a moment ago without leaving a single injury. A normal person's jaw would have been shattered. This guy was extraordinary. He had to be Thor. So, Tony went on, raising an eyebrow, if you really are Thor, how come I'm able to hold Mjolnir? Damien's eyes sparked with challenge. You're asking me the same question I want to ask you. Why can't you wield your own hammer? Tony said nothing at first, then repeated, almost to himself. Exactly. Why can't I lift my weapon, Thor? From a few feet away, Daisy watched the exchange in wide-eyed wonder. Today's surprise confrontation was more magical than she'd ever imagined, and infinitely more entertaining. Chapter 7. Exile. Can you tell us what happened? Jane's voice was low, threaded with worry as she looked at Damien. He stared at Mjolnir, still hovering just out of reach. After every futile attempt to lift the hammer, his spirits had sunk. He took a slow breath before answering. I made a terrible mistake, one that infuriated my father. Tony exchanged a concerned glance with Daisy. Jane leaned forward, her eyes searching. Damien's voice dropped even lower. Odin stripped me of my powers, reclaimed Mjolnir, and banished me to Midgard. Jane's brow furrowed. Daisy shifted in her seat, curiosity and sympathy mingling on her face. At first, I thought he was being vindictive, Damien admitted, running a hand through his hair. But there's no denying it now. I'm exiled. I cannot return to Asgard. Silence fell over the room. None of them knew what to say next, and Damien let the stillness speak for him. Chapter 152, One Drink Too Many. Tell me exactly what went wrong, Tony Stark said, his tone surprisingly grave. The news that Damien, the exiled god of thunder, had been cast down to Earth was nothing short of seismic. With Odin's life slipping away, Asgard desperately needed Damien to take the throne and continue its guardianship of Blue Star. Without him, both realms would be left vulnerable. Damien ran a hand through his hair, eyes downcast. I know I made a huge mistake, but unless I explain exactly what happened, I can't clear my head or figure out how to fix it. Tony narrowed his eyes. Then give me the facts. I can't help you unless I understand the situation. Even stripped of much of his legendary might, Damien's Asgardian blood still pulsed with power. His return to the throne wasn't just a matter of family pride. It was the linchpin holding Asgard's support for Blue Star in place. Tony felt that helping Damien reclaim his heritage was the right thing to do. Damien sighed, meeting Tony's steady gaze. All right, this will take a minute. He settled back and began recounting the chain of errors that had felled a god, hoping Tony's brilliant mind could piece together a way to set things right. Damien sank into his chair, eyes fixed on the table as if he could bury his shame beneath its wood. Because of my arrogance and recklessness, I stormed into Jotunheim on a whim and ended up reigniting an ancient war. Now the 9 realms, once at peace, are teetering on the brink of chaos. Thor stood nearby, guilt weighing on his broad shoulders. Having been stripped of his godly powers and cast down to Midgard, he'd had plenty of time to think, and he finally understood the fury his father felt. He pressed his palms together, voice thick with regret. What was I thinking? All we ever wanted was harmony. Tony Stark folded his arms, blinking in disbelief. You spilled out of a bar stool, got all heroic, and off you went? Great plan. Damien gave a half-hearted shrug. I was a little drunk. I saw my chance, and I took it without thinking through the fallout. Thor let out a rueful chuckle. Trust me, I'd love to mock you right now, but I've been there. Look, you're not beyond redemption. You still have the chance to reclaim your powers and return to Asgard where you belong. Don't forget, Mjolnir only obeys the worthy. It followed you all the way to Earth for a reason. Tony stepped forward and placed a hand on Damien's shoulder. You've got bigger problems than a bruised ego, but we'll fix this, together. He offered a wry smile. Now, let's figure out how to stop a full-blown war. You're right, I can't lift my hammer anymore, Thor admitted, staring at Mjolnir lying inert at his feet. And less than 2 days after it slipped from my grasp, I begged you to bring it back. Tony offered a reassuring nod. You know the hammer only responds to the worthy. If the conditions are met again, you'll be able to wield Mjolnir and regain your power. Thor let out a weary sigh. Believe me, I want nothing more than to have it back and return to Asgard, but this isn't something we'll fix in a day. Then let's go up to my place, Tony suggested. We'll sit down, talk it through, and come up with a plan. Thor's expression brightened at the offer. Tony glanced at him and asked, By the way, do you know exactly what makes someone worthy? Thor shook his head. Only fragments. Someone told me after I first lifted the hammer, but I've never had the full picture. Tony picked up Mjolnir again, slung it over his shoulder, and started toward the villa. Over his shoulder he called back, Who was this person? How did they learn the criteria? Damien watched them with a puzzled frown. He has no intention of meeting you, so I'm not disclosing it. Then let's decide together what conditions must be met to lift Mjolnir. As soon as the research is complete, your Thunder God powers will be fully restored. Tony didn't utter Damien's name. Instead, he smoothly shifted the conversation to more pressing matters. Thor, sensing Tony's reticence, gave a wry smile. We're all guests here. No need to linger at the doorstep. Please, come in. Jane and Daisy exchanged hesitant glances at the grand entrance until Tony's invitation carried from within. They stepped into Stark Manor, though Daisy, her initial excitement now tempered by caution, moved softly, eyes darting across the gleaming surfaces. Jane, on the other hand, replayed fragments of the conversation she'd overheard. It was clear she'd stumbled into a world of gods and cutting-edge science far beyond anything she had imagined. Tony led the small group up a sweeping staircase. On the second floor, the lobby unfolded before them. Sleek steel and glass architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city below, and the gentle hum of advanced machinery, the unmistakable signature of Stark technology. Damien retrieved a bottle of wine from his satchel and held it out to Saul. "Care for a drink?" Saul glanced at the wine, then shook his head. "Thanks, but I'm not in the mood." Damien gave a small, understanding smile and set the bottle aside. He still felt a flicker of guilt. This whole excursion to Blue Star had been his father's way of toughening him up. Stripped of his previous rank, Damien was supposed to learn firsthand how life worked on a rougher world. "As long as I make the most of this assignment, I can return home," Damien said, more to himself than anyone else. He exchanged glances with Jane and Daisy. Both women shook their heads, silently acknowledging the stakes. Pouring a glass for himself, Damien took a slow sip. "But if I fail," his voice trailed off, "I'll be stuck here indefinitely." Thor's deep voice rumbled through the chamber. "Settle your nerves first," he said with a wry smile. "Before you can hope to lift Mjolnir, you need to understand its terms." Damien met Thor's gaze, his expression steady despite the tension rising in his chest. "What are those conditions?" Thor leaned forward, arms crossed over his chest. The others, Sol, Jane, and Daisy, drew closer, bracing themselves for the answer. Damien studied Mjolnir as it lay before him, its runes glowing faintly in the torchlight. "I heard there are only 2 ways to lift this hammer," he said, voice low. 1, you must be pure of heart, worthy in the eyes of Odin. 2, you simply overpower its magic with enough brute force. Tony Stark laughed and leaned back against the stone railing. "Discard the first option. That ship has sailed. No mortal has ever proved worthy of Mjolnir. And as for raw strength, forget it. My father's enchantment is absolute. Even the Hulk couldn't budge it." Thor's face grew serious. Though stripped of much of his power and trapped in a mortal form, his godly presence remained unmistakable. "I expected better of you, Stark. To hear you defend my father's honor, even in this realm, means you still cling to hope of regaining your divine might. But believe it or not, someone has confirmed to me that both methods are real." Damien exchanged a surprised glance with Saul. Tony spread his hands in a mocking shrug. "So you're telling me someone might actually lift it by sheer unfiltered strength?" Thor fell silent for a heartbeat, eyes never leaving the hammer. Then he spoke, voice measured and deep. "We shall soon find out." A hush settled over the chamber as all eyes turned to Mjolnir, the question of worthiness, and the power of raw force hanging in the air. "You've just demonstrated that you can't lift it the second way, so whether the claim is true or false is irrelevant. What concerns us is the first method, understanding the very heart of justice." Damien made no move to defend himself. He simply sank into the sofa, drink in hand, and watched Saul speak with composed deliberation. Chapter 153. What exactly is the heart of justice? Thor stared at Tony, curiosity etched on his face. He'd heard Tony mention someone who'd given an explanation, but who was it, and what had they said? "Justice," Thor repeated slowly, "means absolute fairness and righteousness." Jane exchanged a wary glance with Daisy before replying. "I doubt it. If justice demanded perfect fairness, I surely wouldn't qualify, yet I managed to lift Mjolnir." She shrugged, and frankly, it was almost accidental. Tony shook his head. "No, that's not it either." He tapped at his phone. "According to the dictionary, justice is." Daisy held up her own phone to intercept his definition. "Sorry, Tony, but this one says something different." She pointed at the entry. "I've got no better explanation than you do." Tony ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not making this up. A reliable source, though I can't tell you who, insisted that only someone with a true heart of justice could pick up Thor's hammer." He looked from Daisy to Jane, earnest at last. "I swear I'm not lying. I just want to help Thor get his hammer back as quickly as possible, and well, I'm curious to understand the rule myself." Thor folded his arms, the silver sheen of Mjolnir's handle glinting in the light. Silence settled over them, as each of the heroes pondered what it truly meant to possess a heart of justice. Thor's mind raced as he replayed the morning's events. If he hadn't gone after Mjolnir himself, If he hadn't panicked and sent Damien rushing back with the hammer by mistake, he wouldn't be in this bewildering conversation now. Tony Stark's words echoed in his ears, and for once Thor found himself forced to consider them seriously. Tony had no reason to lie. The moment they met, he didn't haggle or demand anything. He simply handed the hammer back. "If you can lift it," Tony had said, "it's yours." That statement hung in the air like a challenge. Only someone deemed worthy by Odin himself could budge Mjolnir, let alone wield its power. Over the centuries, Thor had used the hammer to crush foes and command storms, but never had he encountered anyone who could lift it through sheer strength. And yet here stood Tony, Beth, insisting it could be done. If Odin were the one who'd proved Tony's point, there'd be no need for this awkward test. Besides, Thor barely knew Stark. In fact, today was the first time he'd even heard the man's name. Something told him Tony genuinely believed someone out there had managed the impossible. Thor swallowed hard, gripping the hammer's handle. If Tony was right, if someone truly had lifted Mjolnir by brute force, then Thor might just reclaim his greatest weapon. The only question left was, who could possibly be strong enough to do it? Damien stared at the data uplinked on the holographic display, his brow furrowed. "There's no way he was acting on Odin's orders," he said. "When Thor was banished to Earth, this stranger didn't just let Mjolnir lie where it fell. He lifted the hammer and handed it right back to him. If it wasn't a command from the All-Father, then that man's strength is beyond anything we've ever seen." He paused, tapping a finger against his chin. And yet his words carry weight. He spoke of having a righteous heart, but what does that really mean? Justice can't be reduced to laws or judgments. Tony Stark leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He's right. Justice isn't just about enforcing rules. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves, which isn't always a courtroom matter. Damien glanced at him. "You're referring to your work in the Iron Man armor?" Tony's expression grew serious. "Exactly. I built that suit with technology decades ahead of its time. Initially, I never meant for it to become a global arms dealer's dream or to profit from war. But when conflict erupted, I used it to save lives. Yes, I made mistakes. The weapons I created fueled wars, and I've paid for that. Still, countless people survived because of it. To many, I'm more than a genius billionaire playboy. I'm a hero." Across the table, Jane Foster folded her arms, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "So when he talked about a heart of justice, was he speaking of your choices, Tony? Or does he expect even more from us?" Silence settled over the room as each of them weighed the question. The fate of worlds and the meaning of true justice hung in the balance. Jane leaned back, resting her gaze on the polished metal of Mjolnir. "Honestly, I'd love to tell Thor exactly how I pulled that off," she admitted. "But the truth is, I still can't explain why Mjolnir recognizes me as worthy." Tony Stark raised an eyebrow. "I get that you don't have all the answers yourself," he said, turning to face her. "But can you describe what was going through your mind at the moment? We want to study the nature of a worthy heart, and who better to learn from than you?" Jane Wenyon's expression remained calm and measured, her words thoughtfully chosen. "I'll share everything, on one condition. You both sign a non-disclosure agreement afterward." Tony nodded after a moment's consideration. He exchanged a quick glance with Daisy. "Of course, this is your private matter, and we wouldn't dream of revealing it without your permission." Jane gave a firm nod, relieved. Tony then shifted his gaze to Daisy, who sat anxiously beside Jane. "I'll sign too," he promised. Caught in Tony Stark's expectant look, Daisy quickly nodded her agreement. "I'll sign it," she said softly. Damien leaned back in his chair, scanning the faces gathered around the polished conference table. Jane and Daisy had already signed the non-disclosure agreement. Only Soul's pen hovered over the page. At last, Damien nodded. "All right," he said softly. "Since you want to understand what shaped me, I'll begin with the event that changed everything." He paused, as if summoning the strength to revisit that dark time. "In 2008, 3 years ago, I was abducted by terrorists in Afghanistan. For weeks, I was their prisoner. I fought them not only with whatever scraps of intelligence I could glean, but with sheer will to survive. I saw firsthand how they repurposed my own weapons, how innocents paid the price for my technology." Jane exchanged a glance with Daisy. recalling the headlines that had announced Tony Stark's disappearance. None of them had suspected a kidnapping, let alone that he'd constructed his first iron armor prototype under fire and sand. Saul watched Damien's face, the low lamplight making his jaw cast a determined shadow. When I finally broke free, Damien continued, voice steady, I realized that as long as Stark Industries built weapons, I would be complicit in that cruelty. So I did the only thing I could. I shut down our entire weapons division. He leaned forward. That decision cost me alliances, fortunes, even friends, but it saved my conscience. He sat back again, letting the weight of his confession settle around the room. Jane cleared her throat. You risked your life just to prove a point. Damien offered a wry half-smile. I risked my life so no one else would have to. Silence followed as they absorbed the gravity of his words. This was the moment that had forged the man before them. But beyond that one incident, there was someone else Tony mentioned, someone who truly astonished Thor. Ethan set me on the path to reform, urged me to abandon my darker impulses, Tony began. But it was another man who changed everything. He showed me I'd been like a frog at the bottom of a well, convinced the sky was only as big as my own little world. He made me realize humanity isn't the sole wise species in this vast cosmos, and that the legends of Odin the All-Father and Thor the Thunder God aren't just old tales spun by our ancestors. They're real. Tony paused, emotion flickering in his eyes as he looked over at Saul. He'd kept his story brief. No mention of Damien's true heritage, the Void Cult, Xandar, or his grand ambition to lead Blue Star into the interstellar age. But even in that short summary, Jane and Daisy could feel the weight of something extraordinary, stirring just beneath the surface. Chapter 154, The Return of the Thunder God. Tony, could you introduce me to the person you've been talking about? I want to see him for myself. Thor studied Tony for a long moment. If Tony was referring to the individual he suspected, someone whose knowledge of the universe might even exceed his own, then this was no trivial request. I can't make that decision for him, he finally said. But he hasn't shown himself to you, Tony pressed on, which means he's chosen to stay out of this. Tony shook his head. He wasn't like the other Void cultists, yet his devotion to Damien was nothing short of fanatical. Blessed by the Void, Tony treated Damien with a reverence that bordered on worship. So he already knows I was stripped of my rank and banished to Earth, Thor mused, raising an eyebrow. And that he's been watching my every move here on Blue Star? Thor's eyes narrowed. He couldn't tell if Tony was pleased or troubled. I don't know how he keeps tabs on you, Tony admitted, but he did say you'd be looking for your Mjolnir. Thor's expression hardened. Which is why I tracked you down, to urge you to reclaim it as soon as possible. Tony's shoulders slumped. I didn't expect you would find me, and discover that you can't lift it anymore. Thor let out a low sigh, the weight of that admission heavier than any hammer. Tony's face grew solemn as he shook his head, bracing himself for what came next. Damien leaned back on the metal bench, running a hand through his hair. That's everything, he said quietly. My mental changes, my journey here, I've laid it all out. Tony Stark folded his arms, studying him for a moment before nodding. So Damien, any insights? Any big revelations? Damien met Tony's gaze, but said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. Tony shrugged and turned to Dr. Jane Foster and Agent Daisy Johnson, who were seated to his right. All right, ladies, he said. What do you think the heart of justice really means? Daisy Johnson was first to speak. She tapped her knuckles against the bench. It isn't about grand speeches or photo ops. It's the willingness to step into harm's way for people who can't protect themselves. Jane Foster smiled thoughtfully. Exactly. It's not just rhetoric. It's a conviction so strong you'd risk your life for it. Tony nodded approvingly, then pointed at the silver head of Mjolnir resting quietly on its stand a few feet away. If you truly believe in that, if you live by that, then, Thor, Mjolnir should recognize you all the same. At the mention of his hammer, Thor Odinson shifted in his seat. Jane straightened. I would fight for the people of Asgard, she said, voice steady, and lay down my life if it came to that. Thor's expression darkened. He rose to his full height, fists clenched. And how is that any different from what Mr. Stark calls the heart of justice? He pointed at Tony. Tony Stark is a Midgardian, one of the Blue Planet's children. He speaks of helping the weak, but he has never defended a kingdom of gods. Jane met Thor's glare without flinching. Perhaps not, she replied, but the willingness to sacrifice yourself for others, that's a principle that transcends worlds. Thor's attention shifted to Damien. At last, Damien looked up, and in his eyes, Thor saw something kindred, a steadfast purpose familiar to any warrior of Asgard. Tony strode forward, breaking the tense pause. Well said, Jane. And Thor, he added with a grin, if any mortal can honor that commitment, I'd bet Mjolnir wouldn't hesitate to let them lift it. Thor's stern face softened into a rare, approving smile. The hammer on its stand gave a faint hum, as if in agreement. In that moment, each of them, mortal and god alike, understood that true worthiness was measured not by blood or birthright, but by the courage to stand for justice, no matter the cost. Damien stood his ground. He's ready to devote himself entirely to Blue Star, ready to defend it, to help it prosper. Isn't that justice enough? Soul's eyes glittered. Then you must be Thor, the god of thunder, if the old legends are correct. As Odin's son and the rightful heir to Asgard, Soul continued, your duty goes far beyond keeping Asgard's peace. You're charged with protecting every realm under your father's care. Soul leaned forward. Now I see why your father grew so furious that he cast you down to the mortal world. As Asgard's prince and future king, you didn't honor your vows. You let your temper spark a war. That rashness warranted a harsh punishment. Only when you fully accept your responsibilities and prove worthy of wielding Mjolnir again will you be permitted to return home. Jane listened, her expression troubled. She knew Tony was holding back parts of the story, but if these were truly the conditions Quake had laid down, she shook her head, determined. Everything depended on whether they were genuine and whether Damien could meet them. That means that even if Tony never says it out loud, he must be ready to protect and advance the interests of Blue Star. Only then can Thor's hammer deem him worthy. Jane didn't doubt that Thor would gladly lay down his life for Asgard, but if mere heroism weren't enough, this proved that Thor had fully embraced the weight of his identity. A heavy responsibility. As Damien listened to Jane's words, a storm churned in his chest. He remembered how in the past, his father had always given him lenient punishments when he slipped up. Yet this time, the consequences were harsher than any he'd ever faced. Now, however, he understood why. His father had intended for him to inherit the throne, an unmistakable vote of confidence in Damien's ability to rule. But instead of biding his time, Damien had rashly sparked an ancient war before he even took the crown. Putting himself in his father's place, Damien finally saw the betrayal through his father's eyes. The anger, the bitterness, the profound disappointment. Only now did he grasp the full measure of the burden he'd shirked, a lesson born of regret and a chance, perhaps, to reclaim his father's trust. I understand everything now. Thor drew in a steadying breath, chastised by the memory of his earlier arrogance. As he rose to his feet, Mjolnir, lying inert on the table, suddenly crackled to life. A bolt of lightning arced from the hammer, and it floated upward to hover directly in front of him. Thor didn't hesitate. He reached out, grasped the handle, and felt an ecstatic surge of power pulse through his veins. Tony's test, an examination of whether Thor had truly comprehended the lessons buried in his heart, had succeeded. Between Tony's briefing and Jane's careful insights, the truth stood undeniable. With that realization, the hammer spoke in that ancient, resonant tone. Welcome back, friend. A rush of exhilaration washed over Thor as the strength he'd lost flowed back into every fiber of his being. In a flash of lightning, his battle armor reassembled around him, and the familiar crimson cloak cascaded down his broad shoulders. Gone was the frustration and doubt, replaced by a radiant, confident smile. Jane and Daisy stared, mouths agape. Though Tony's word had prepared them for Thor's return, nothing could have braced them for this moment. "Oh my God," Jane whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Daisy could only nod, eyes wide, as Thor stood tall once more, worthy of wielding Mjolnir and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 7, The Righteous Heart. Behold, this is the God of Thunder. Damien watched, a pleased smile spreading across his face as Thor's hammer flew back into its master's hand. Thor turned to his friends, Tony, Jane, and Daisy, and bowed his head in gratitude. "Tony, Jane, Daisy, thank you. Without you, I would still be lost in regret and confusion, unable to grasp my father's true intentions or the weight of Asgard's crown. Damien stepped forward. Reclaiming your hammer proved one thing: raw strength alone does not a good king make. A ruler must also show compassion, uphold justice, and genuinely desire to serve his people. Thor paused, exchanging looks with you. The Jane and Daisy then faced Tony. Actually, you should thank Jane Foster. You set the terms, Tony, but it was her unwavering righteousness that truly brought Mjolnir back to me. Tony puffed out his chest in mock pride. Exactly. All hail Miss Foster's heroic heart. Jane and Daisy smiled, relief evident on their faces. And Damien, alongside everyone else, felt a newfound lightness in the air. With Thor's faith restored, he would soon return to Asgard. Earth, and even Tony's alter ego as Blue Star, could exhale at last. No more hiding behind steel armor, no more fearing the world outside. Peace, at least for now, was within reach. Don't worry, Damien said, meeting Jane's eyes. I know what I've promised her, and I intend to keep it. He turned back to Jane and added with a reassuring smile, I'll help you find every answer you're looking for. At his words, the gleaming thunder armor that had cloaked him shimmered and fell away, revealing his true Asgardian form. With the full power of the god of thunder restored, he could have returned to Asgard on a whim. Instead, he chose to remain in the mortal realm a little longer, to repay Jane's kindness. As for Tony Stark, well, that was a matter for another day. This is Chapter 5. Please remember to cast your vote. Chapter 155. Anyone can be young and frivolous. Thor settled beside Jane Foster in a sunlit grove, Mjolnir resting at his feet. He began to unravel the mysteries of Asgard for her. The vast world tree, Yggdrasil, whose branches spanned the 9 realms, the glittering halls of Alfheim, the forge fires of Nidavellir, the icy chasms of Jotunheim, and every world in between. As he spoke, Jane listened in awe, her mind alight with visions of a cosmos teeming with wonder. Nearby, Tony Stark, having just reclaimed Thor's hammer, had intended to send the Thunder God packing. Yet when he overheard his explanations, he paused. Although Damien had given him a primer on the 9 realms and the All-Father's cosmic stature, Stark's grasp of Asgardian power was still superficial. If Earth, Blue Star, as Thor called it, could one day rival Asgard's grandeur, humanity would finally secure its rightful place in the universe. With renewed interest, Stark tapped at his holo display, quietly absorbing every detail. Meanwhile, in the golden spires of Asgard, a new ruler assumed the throne. With Thor exiled to Midgard, Loki, backed by Queen Frigga, had claimed regal authority. But the crown alone did not sate him. He hungered for his parents' genuine approval, not merely as the understudy who stepped in for an absent brother. Under the cover of night, Loki slipped through a hidden passage known only to the royal family. There, beyond prying eyes, he set into motion a web of secret plans designed to prove that he was more than the spare heir, to show that even the youngest can be a force to reckon with. Meanwhile, a small group of Thor's comrades gathered in secret, determined to find a way to bring him home. In their eyes, Thor had made a mistake, but stripping him of his divine power and banishing him to the mortal realm was far too cruel. Even if he could never ascend the throne again, he didn't deserve total erasure. Under cover of twilight, they made their way to the Rainbow Bridge, hoping to sway Heimdall. "You're early," Heimdall greeted them, as if he'd been expecting their arrival. Sif stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Heimdall, what is Thor's condition? Where is he now?" The all-seeing guardian stood tall, his armor glinting in the fading light. "Thor is in good health," he replied evenly. "If Odin consents to his return, he will come back to Asgard without issue, but there can be no rescue mission undertaken without the king's explicit command." A flicker of warning passed through Heimdall's golden eyes. "Disobey the All-Father's decree, and you will answer for it. Do not underestimate the consequences of defying Odin's will." Is Thor really doing well? Don't lie. How could a god, stripped of his divine powers, thrive in the human realm? The portly, bearded man glared at Heimdall. "Return them at once. No one enters the 9 realms under false pretenses." Heimdall said nothing more. With a swift motion, he banished the intruders back through the gates. Sif's voice was barely a whisper. "You still distrust Thor's word?" Heimdall only shook his head. Once, Thor had lost the right to wield Mjolnir, and so could have ignored any call from Asgard. But with Tony Stark's help, the one who first lifted the fallen hammer, Thor had reclaimed his worthiness. The hammer itself had acknowledged him again. Even if he chose to disregard Heimdall's summons now, Thor possessed other means of returning home. With Thor's path to Asgard secured, Heimdall saw no reason to defy him or force him on a longer route. He knew Thor's claim to leadership was stronger than Loki's, and Loki's conspicuous absence from Asgard only confirmed that mischief, once again, was afoot. He couldn't bring himself to admit that Thor had already reclaimed his divine power. "Let's head back," he said curtly. When Heimdall appeared, Sif allowed herself a flicker of hope. If anyone spoke the truth, it was Heimdall. He would never lie about Thor's condition. Still, doubt lingered. "But," she began. The burly, bearded warrior glanced at Sif in confusion as he turned away from the lower realm. He opened his mouth to argue, but Sif shook her head sharply. Reluctantly, the little band retraced their steps along the path they had come. Just as they passed through the portal, Heimdall's voice rang out behind them. "I think Thor will be very pleased to learn you're safe, and even more pleased if you choose to defy his orders and return." Sif paused, her tension easing. A small, genuine smile curved her lips. "I'm just grateful to know Sol is all right," she whispered. On Blue Star, within the grand halls of Stark Manor in New York, Sol spent the entire day walking Jane through the wonders of the cosmos. From sunrise to sunset, he guided her through star charts and spectral analyses, opening her eyes to a universe brimming with intelligent life. Of course, Blue Star lay under Asgard's protective ward, so no ordinary alien horde dared threaten it, but the realization that countless worlds teemed with life changed Jane's perspective forever. By the end of the day, astronomy had become not just a science to her, but a thrilling gateway to the mysteries of existence. Jane leaned forward, pen poised over her notebook. So ordinary people wouldn't dare to go there. Only alien beings with enough courage or power could? Thor met her gaze steadily. "Exactly. In the ancient war I started, it was the frost giants of Jotunheim who proved the boldest and most formidable foes. They nearly threw the 9 realms into chaos until my grandfather and father finally ended the conflict." He paused, a shadow of regret crossing his face. "Since then, we've enjoyed many years of peace. Even when skirmishes flare up now, they're always internal disputes, no outside invasions. But I was young and reckless. Inflated by my own strength, I broke the old treaty. With that safeguard gone, the frost giants could return at any moment." Thor bowed his head, shame evident in his posture. "I take full responsibility for my arrogance." Tony Stark watched the Asgardian prince, then offered wryly, "Well, when you're Odin's son, a little swagger is almost guaranteed." Chapter 7, Awakening. Damien epitomized the spoiled scion of immense wealth, confident to the point of arrogance, convinced that his talents and instincts were infallible. Like many privileged heirs, he'd never faced true danger or disappointment, and no plea from friends or family could shake his certainty that he was always in the right. It was only when real peril struck that he and everyone around him would discover the danger of unchecked pride. That reckoning came with the fall of Thor. Stripped of his godly power and cast into the mortal realm, the once mighty Thunderer wandered lost and powerless. Had he not crossed paths with Damien, Thor might simply have summoned Mjolnir back to the heavens, ignorant of, or indifferent to, the hammer's ancient stipulations for worthiness. But Damien was there to intercept him. Skillfully returning Mjolnir to its resting place, he took the time to explain the hammer's true conditions. Only a heart that had faced hardship, humility, and sacrifice could lift it again. Standing nearby, Jane Foster, herself shaped by struggle and insight, saw beyond the runes. Her gentle but unflinching words struck Damien to the core, dissolving his complacency in an instant. With that spark, Damien awoke to his own arrogance. He guided Thor through the hammer's trials, sparing the thunder god weeks of needless suffering. And in leading Thor back to humility, Damien found his own path to enlightenment. Only by confronting their shared folly could both men prove themselves worthy of the gifts they had once taken for granted. First daily update of 10,000 words, delivered. Chapter 156, A Big Shot? As long as you recognize your mistakes and learn from them going forward. I wasn't exactly a villain, but I certainly wasn't a good person either. At that time, I was utterly incapable of helping anyone. Tony spoke deliberately, offering Saul a measure of reassurance. After spending a full day together, he finally understood why his impression of Saul had been so positive. Saul wasn't just another privileged youth. Tony saw in him the very spirit of Blue Star's patron saint. What struck Tony most, however, was how much Saul reminded him of his own reckless younger self. As the old saying goes, a prodigal son never learns, and Saul had made his share of spectacular blunders. Fortunately, his father had always been there to pick up the pieces, so no lasting harm had come of it, for now. Tony was convinced that if Saul took responsibility for his missteps from this point on, he would grow into a truly worthy king of Asgard. Damien watched Thor's broad shoulders relax for the first time since their battle. The storm god gave him a grateful nod and spoke in a low, earnest tone. "Damien, thank you. Honestly, you've done more than I could have ever hoped." Thor paused, then offered another kindness. "If you're intrigued by our technology, if you'd like to see Asgard with your own eyes, I could arrange it." Damien forced a small smile and shook his head. "I truly appreciate the offer, but I already have a direction I need to follow here on Midgard. And even more important, if a mere mortal like me steps into Asgard, I'd be breaking customs I don't yet understand. Imagine offending your father, or some ancient law I've never heard of. I'd rather not risk becoming a helpless prisoner or worse." Thor's expression flickered with concern as he absorbed Damien's words. Then he laid a massive hand on Damien's shoulder. "Very well. But if there is any other way I can repay you, anything at all, just speak and it will be done." Damien returned the gesture with a firm nod. "Thank you, my friend, and someday, I promise, I'll find a way to return the favor." "You needn't worry so much," Saul said quietly. "If you're willing to stand guard over Blue Star whenever she's in danger, that alone will be the greatest aid you can give me." Damien met his gaze. "If the Nine Realms ever come under threat, it will be my duty to help." "I won't forget this kindness," Damien added firmly. Saul inclined his head with serious eyes. "Then I'll remember it too. There's plenty of time ahead, and countless chances to put our promises to the test." At those words, Damien straightened. "If you don't mind my asking, how old are you? I realize I haven't even learned your true age." A faint smile crossed Saul's features. "I've just turned 41. Damien blinked. 41. Most humans only live 100 years or so. With your civilization's advances and your noble line, you should see at least 90, if not more. You've still got nearly 50 years ahead. That's plenty of time." Saul chuckled softly and nodded. The two men sat in companionable silence, the weight of both future battles and the years to come momentarily suspended between them. Saul's soft whir of calculations filled the Void's command chamber as Tony Stark leaned back, arms folded. He gave a confident grin. "Yeah, I'm still young," he said. If he'd never joined the Void and survived its relentless surprises, he might have died of old age at 90. Now, he might even outlive Thor. After all, as Damien had reminded him, the Asgardians were advanced life forms, but not true immortals. Honestly, if Thor hadn't mentioned it, Tony never would have realized. From the corridor nearby, Daisy poked her head in, amusement in her eyes. She took in the gleaming steel of Tony's armor. "Mr. Stark, why wear your suit at home? Isn't that a bit much?" Tony shrugged, still smiling. "Well, when your roommate is Thor, god of thunder, it pays to feel extra secure." Thor gave a hearty laugh, Mjolnir resting lightly on his shoulder. "Next time, Anthony, I'll host you, out with a proper Asgardian banquet." "Sounds good," Tony replied. Then, more seriously, he added, "Actually, I plan to stick around Earth, Blue Star, for a while. I showed up here with no warning and no cash." He glanced at Thor. "Mind lending me some coin until I get settled?" The Thunder God's laughter rumbled warmly. "A loan from the son of Odin? Of course, my friend." Damien had learned from Daisy that Tony Stark was one of the wealthiest men on Blue Star, and that handing him a few $1,000,000 would be like giving away pocket change. Since Damien already owed Tony a favor, he didn't hesitate. "Sure," he said. Tony's eyes lit up. Saul, the hungry drifter who'd been campside Stark Tower all day, had gone without food for nearly 24 hours. While his superhuman endurance kept him from collapsing, hunger was still an awful burden. If a cash payment would make Saul leave, Tony was more than willing to help. "He doesn't have a bank account," Tony told Damien. "I'll transfer the money to Miss Foster." He tapped his comm. Jarvis, send $5 million to Miss Foster's account. Certainly, sir. Transfer in progress. $5 million? Jarvis echoed, a hint of surprise in his voice. Jane Foster, standing beside Daisy, stared at Tony in disbelief. She knew he was rich. After all, he owned half the city, but $5 million on a whim was still staggering. Daisy's jaw dropped too, and the two of them exchanged astonished glances. Tony merely smiled. Jane, Daisy, come with me. He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Damien certain that once saw his bank balance swell, he'd be long gone, and their little problem would be solved. I haven't been much fun as a host, Tony admitted sheepishly. Why don't you let Saul take you on a trip to New York instead? Thanks, Thor replied with genuine relief, a broad grin spreading across his face. Moments later, Jane Foster's phone chimed with a notification. Tony had just sent $5,007,000. Jane stared at the number in disbelief. She'd never held that much money in her life, no matter that Tony had routed it through Saul and it was only on temporary loan. It was still absurd. She hastily took a screenshot. Thank you, she messaged back. Have a great time in New York. Tony gave her a casual wave and turned away. Thor tapped his hammer, transforming it into a stylish umbrella, and led Jane and Daisy down the winding road from Stark Manor. Both women were still in shock. Daisy peered at Jane's screen again. 1, 10, 100, 1,000, a million? She leaned in so close Jane could hear her whisper, Is this for real? Are they actually millionaires? $5 million. And she's still just an intern. Once she finally lands a full-time position, it would take her at least 10 years to pull in that kind of money. Yet Tony Stark hands it over to Thor as if it were spare change. Daisy couldn't help but feel a surge of awe. Is this really what friendship between legends looks like? A moment later, the second update pinged through. Chapter 157, The more you learn, the stranger it gets. Before you go, Tony Stark called after them. I need you to sign these. He tapped a slim folder in his hand to emphasize the point. If anything you saw or heard today ever gets out, don't blame me. Damien, Jane, and Daisy hesitated at the threshold of the workshop. In one smooth motion, Tony leapt up to the mezzanine and disappeared down the hatch into his underground lab. Moments later, he re-emerged carrying 2 crisp confidentiality agreements, a pair of pens, and an ink pot thick with red seal paste. He laid everything out on the workbench. Your signatures and your fingerprints in the red ink, right here, he said, nodding to the designated spots on the contracts. No exceptions. Damien exchanged a glance with Jane and Daisy. Jane was the first to step forward. She had already agreed in principle. Everything she'd witnessed today was far too sensitive to ever go public, but she still flipped through the document carefully, scanning each clause for hidden pitfalls. Satisfied that it simply barred them from disclosing any details of his research or operations, she signed her name and pressed her fingertip into the crimson seal paste. Daisy followed suit, reading only a few lines before shrugging. The terms were stringent. Any leak, any rumor traced back to them, and Tony Stark would hold them personally responsible, with severe consequences spelled out in stark, uncompromising language. But Daisy had no qualms. She flourished a quick signature and left her print beside Jane's, smearing a bright red dot onto the page. Damien watched as Tony collected the completed agreements, tucking them away with a satisfied grin. Welcome to the team, he said lightly, although there was nothing particularly welcoming about a legal gag order. Now, let's get back to work. Jane, Daisy, and Damien stepped back, exchanged wry smiles, and followed Tony deeper into the lab's shadows. As the heavy door thudded shut behind them, the three of them realized just how mysterious and high-stakes Stark's world really was, and how little they were allowed to say about it. Tony Stark had a reputation for never turning down a pretty face, or a pretty pair, for that matter. If you wanted to take home 2 beautiful women at once, you didn't need charm or persuasion. You just laid out the cash. No one sold themselves cheaply, of course, but once the price was high enough, most of them gave in. Life was short, and when there was a shortcut that cost only money, who wouldn't take it? Sadly for her, Daisy realized her own worth fell well below Tony's threshold. Thor watched it all in silence, offering no objections. On Blue Star, Stark's celebrity rivaled his in Asgard, and prestige was not something to jeopardize. Finally, with a casual grin, Tony took the signed contract, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Have fun, you two. You've done me a favor, so consider this my thanks." He stood and straightened his jacket. "Let me show you around town. Anywhere in particular you'd like to go?" Across the room, Saul caught the hesitant glances passing between Daisy and Jane. He stepped forward with a grin of his own. "Don't worry about expenses. If Mr. Stark here won't spring for it, I've got plenty of other ways to cover the bill." With that, the three of them set off into the night, two curious women eager for adventure, and two men more than willing to fund whatever thrills they could find. Damien stepped into the immortal palace with a quiet confidence. He casually produced a handful of glittering treasures, ancient trinkets easily convertible into a king's ransom, and shrugged as if it were spare change. "I'm thinking the presidential suite," he announced, his eyes dancing with anticipation. "Top floor, all the works, and after that, I want the grandest feast they can muster." Daisy let out an eager whoop and shot her hand into the air, practically vibrating with excitement. Though they were only friends, nothing more, she felt no hesitation about making her wishes known. Damien had instead on showing them the wonders of the realms. It felt only fair to let him spoil them a little. "Count me in," she called, eyes bright. "Lid on, Damien." Jane, usually reserved, couldn't help but smile at Damien's generosity. She gave him a grateful nod, her cheeks coloring. Damien met her gaze and returned the smile. He was determined, no strings attached, just a heartfelt thank you for standing by him through every trial. More than any lavish accommodations or feasts, Damien's true gift to himself had come earlier, regaining the right to wield Thor's hammer. Forced to descend from the Bifrost without Heimdall's aid, he'd endured his father's stern judgment and emerged stronger for it. Now, with that burden lifted and his name cleared, he vowed to reward Jane and Daisy for their support before finally returning home to Asgard. Tonight, though, the palace's finest banquet awaited, and Damien intended to savor every glorious bite. "All right, I'll just hail a cab, then." Daisy jumped to her feet, beaming when Saul nodded in agreement. Once Saul's car pulled away from the manor gates, Tony finally peeled off his armor, exposing his youthful, handsome face. He sank onto the sofa and called out, "Jarvis, I need a midnight snack. Budget is no object." "Of course, sir," came Jarvis's calm reply. "Miss Pepper and I have already taken care of everything." "Perfect," Tony sighed, flopping back into the cushions like a rag doll. He'd spent the entire day on edge, nervous that his secret might slip. Now that it was over, all he wanted was food. "By the way, Thor's gone, right?" Pepper stepped out of the study and paused at the doorway, surveying Tony's languid sprawl. "Yes, he's left. I slipped Saul some extra cash, too. Let him enjoy himself on Earth. He won't be dropping in on us again anytime soon." Tony turned to her with a grateful grin. "Thanks, Pepper. You're a lifesaver." For safety's sake, Tony insisted that Pepper remain behind closed doors until Jarvis gave the all-clear. Thor, after all, would have no reason to question his own might. He'd only seen the power of the Iron Man suit, not the man inside it. And since the Thunder God hadn't laid eyes on Pepper yet, he remained oblivious to her above-average fitness. Pepper, already briefed and prepared, contented herself in her quarters with snacks and a movie while Tony readied his next move. Outwit Thor, return Mjolnir, and send the Asgardian home as quickly as possible. "Jarvis says you're good to go," Tony announced as Pepper stepped into the workshop. She smoothed her crisp white coat, then reached out to massage the tension from his shoulders. "Thanks for letting me in," she teased. "I've been cooped up, and I'm starving." Tony wrapped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. "I know, Pepper." She paused, her brow furrowing. "Tony, what if Thor really isn't here as part of an alien invasion?" He frowned, stepping back to look at her. "You mean Mr. Damien's intel was wrong? Someone else must have set this up?" Pepper nodded, eyes bright with unspoken urgency. Together, they turned back to the workshop's wide windows, where lightning danced around a hammer that refused to budge, ready to uncover the truth behind their unexpected guest. "Probably, but there's no need to worry," Damien said, leaning back casually. "I can handle it, and Thor will be stationed on Blue Star for the foreseeable future. If things ever get out of hand, I can just call on the God of Thunder." Tony's eyes flickered with surprise. Every time he thought he'd figured out Damien's plan, he realized there was another layer he hadn't seen. How many more moves ahead had Damien anticipated? And yet, this man, so adept at foreseeing threats and mastering combat, had no intention of striking first at Blue Star. Damien is incredible, Tony admitted. He saw all of this coming. Pepper exchanged a glance with Tony, admiration shining in her eyes. Understood. If anything happens, we'll set pride aside and ask Damien for help. Tony nodded, relief evident on his face. Chapter 158. I am very disappointed in you. Damien watched Thor, his divine power fully restored, strolling through the streets of New York with Jane, his would-be girlfriend and her closest friends. He tore his gaze away. He had no desire to see Thor today. Tony Stark's involvement changes nothing fundamental. No matter how many shortcuts Stark provides, Thor will endure hardship, prove himself worthy of Mjolnir once more, reclaim the hammer, and return to Asgard. Stark's help only speeds up what was always inevitable. Worse, if Thor encounters Damien, or even more dangerously, comes under his influence, he could be tempted to join the Void. That would draw Odin's attention to Earth and jeopardize the lineup for next year's inaugural Avengers Assembly. Damien isn't in any hurry. He has every confidence in his ability to turn Saul to his cause in due time. Thor isn't Odin. The Allfather has lived for millennia, enduring countless trials and mastering immeasurable power. Thor, by contrast, is still growing into his strength, and he doesn't yet understand that his true power lies within himself, not in the hammer he wields. Thor would have to face powerful foes and daunting trials before he could truly come into his own. Nor would it be long before Saul met Jane Foster, the woman destined to capture his heart, even as she battled the illness that threatened to claim her. At that moment, winning Saul's affections might have seemed easy, yet if Thor pressed his suit too soon, he risked invoking Odin's ire. Now was hardly the time to storm in and declare his intentions. Damien tore his gaze away and settled back into his meal in Chinatown, unhurried and untroubled. Loki, ever watchful, suspected that Thor's journey to Blue Star would begin shortly, and he planned to be front and center when the real drama unfolded. Over the following week, Saul whisked Jane and her friend Daisy from one lavish New York hotspot to the next. In that brief span, his relationship with Jane blossomed by leaps and bounds. Jane's quick wit and steady help endeared her to him. Saul's dashing looks and easy humor made Jane's heart flutter in return. Although the attraction between them was palpable, neither had yet dared to cross the final threshold. On one bright morning, Saul surprised them both by renting a seaside villa for their next respite. The villa stood just beyond the city's roar, its terrace opening onto sun-drenched sands and the endless shimmer of the ocean, a fitting stage for whatever came next. Jane and Daisy both epitomized different kinds of beauty. Jane with her sultry confidence, Daisy with her bright, energetic charm, and Damien found himself caught up in their laughter as they splashed through the shallows. For a blissful moment, the three of them simply enjoyed the warmth of the sun and the feel of the sea. Then, a striking figure appeared on the dunes, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, his long black hair falling in a sleek curtain over his shoulders. Damien's smile faltered. "Thor, what's wrong?" Jane called, concern creasing her brow. Damien glanced toward the shore, his tone suddenly serious. "My brother's arrived. Daisy, come here for a minute." Thor's eyebrows shot up. "Your brother?" "I'll explain later," Damien said, and with a subtle nod, he and Daisy waded back toward the sand. Moments later, another man stepped into the surf. Loki, cool and composed. Damien paused, water beating on his skin, and greeted him quietly. "Brother, you made it. I take it you're settling in all right?" Loki offered a rare, gentle smile. "I've found some friends who helped me through the roughest times," he replied. "It's not Asgard, but life here isn't so bad." Thor swam up behind them and surveyed the scene with a grin. He swept an arm in the direction of Jane and Daisy. "So which one of those two has stolen your heart?" Loki cast a quick glance toward the laughing women at the water's edge, then met Thor's gaze. A faint, knowing smile curved his lips. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Damien shook his head. "Neither of they. Daisy and Jane are just friends for now." He glanced over his shoulder and saw the two young women chatting a few dozen meters away under Blue Star's twin suns. Loki studied him for a moment, a thoughtful smile playing on his lips. You've adapted to life here surprisingly quickly, Loki observed. Then, with a sharper tilt of his head, he asked, "But what brings you to us today?" Before Damien could reply, Thor's stormy eyes flickered across the clearing. He took a slow step forward. "I came with news," he said in a low voice. "Our father is dead." At those words, Loki's expression crumpled in disbelief and grief. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." Thor's gaze hardened. "I know how much you loved him, brother, but he died because of the chaos you unleashed, and I had to pick up the pieces you left behind." Loki's hands clenched at his sides. "That's impossible. After ambush at Vanaheim, I helped him regain his powers. He forgave me. He survived. I need to return and see for myself." Thor shook his head, pain edged in his voice. "He survived your betrayal once. He did it again to protect all of us. And yet you claim his death is my fault?" He took a breath, eyes burning. "Tell me it isn't true, Loki. Tell me there's another explanation." A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the distant laughter of Daisy and Jane on the alien horizon. Loki's voice was steady, but his words struck like ice. "Brother, you can't come home." Thor's jaw clenched. His eyes flashed with disbelief. "I know it's hard to accept that without Mjolnir you've lost your powers," Loki continued, "but since Father's death, the crown of Asgard and all its responsibilities now rest with me." Thor stared, shocked and unwilling to believe it. Loki watched his brother's expression harden and pressed on. "Now that I wear the crown, it's my duty to keep the realm safe. You can't return to Asgard." Still reeling, Thor tried to reason with him. "Damien, you must know that neither of us possesses Father's full strength. That's exactly why I halted the war with the Frost Giants. We negotiated an armistice that explicitly demands your banishment. Without it, they'd flood back through the 9 realms and plunder us again." Mother agreed. Loki's lips twisted in contempt. "So I'm banished at the insistence of a treaty with our enemies. How noble." Thor's disappointment was plain in his eyes. "I wish I didn't have to do this, Loki. Believe me, I wouldn't lie to you." A flicker of surprise passed over Loki's face. Had his brother read through every layer of his scheme? He forced himself to appear calm, hiding his uncertainty behind a mask of icy composure. Then, with a quiet nod, he turned and strode away, leaving Thor standing alone at the edge of his shattered dreams. It's impossible for someone as powerful as Father to die so suddenly. Even if you claim he's truly gone and you've rightfully taken the throne, a mere armistice won't curb the Frost Giants' ambitions in Jotunheim. Asgard is already weakened. You should have let me reclaim the power of the God of Thunder. Only then could we guarantee peace across the 9 realms. But instead, you lied and said Father was dead. You even insisted that the armistice included my exile. My mother went along with it? Ridiculous. Had Father really banished me, Mother would have intervened without hesitation. And if there'd been any chance for my return, she would have made it happen. Thor studied Loki, disappointment clouding his eyes. "That's wishful thinking. Right now, recalling you isn't an option. Signing this treaty is the best way to secure peace for all 9 realms." Loki's gaze wavered at Thor's cold dismissal of their mother's loyalty, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew Thor's power had diminished. There was no point in panic. Instead, he spoke quietly, choosing his words with care. "Are you still trying to lie to me?" Thor's voice was low, edged with ice. Loki met his brother's gaze, unflinching. "I'm disappointed in you, Loki," Thor said, disappointment curdling Gov into anger. With a sudden motion, Thor extended his hand toward the darkening sky. Clouds churned overhead, roiling with thunder. In an instant, Mjolnir screamed down through the tempest, returning to its master's grip at breakneck speed. A jagged bolt of lightning crackled around Thor, and in a heartbeat, the panting figure in nothing but swimming trunks vanished, replaced by the full, thunderous glory of the god of Asgard. Chapter 159. You seem to be in trouble. "Isn't your divine power supposed to be gone?" Loki asked, eyes flicking up to the sky's roiling clouds. Thor's jaw tightened. With a crackle of Asgardian magic, the thunder god armor snapped into place around him, and Mjolnir hovered into his hand. "Am I not giving you cause for celebration?" he replied. Loki's lips curved into a sly smile. "On the contrary, I'm relieved I didn't rush to tell you sooner that you'd regained your strength." Thor's grip on the hammer grew ice cold. "Enough riddles. What's your plan, Loki?" His aura flared with a predatory intensity. Thor had not spent the past week on the blue star idly enjoying its sights. He'd scrutinized every choice he'd ever made, every victory and every failure, to decide which paths were truly worthy of a god. Only by confronting his mistakes could he show his father that he had finally grown up. He remembered all too well his reckless dash to Jotunheim, driven by youthful arrogance. Odin had scolded him, and though Thor's pride had smarted at the rebuke, in the end he'd resolved to temper his impulses and mend his ways. Now, sword and lightning at the ready, he stood across from his brother, determined not to let past follies dictate his future. Loki had deliberately sharpened Thor's emotions, drawing his brother into a single-minded desire to march into the forbidden realm of Jotunheim and wipe out every trace of its threat. Thor knew only too well that, at that moment, Loki shared the same burning resolve. Then everything went wrong. Odin stripped Thor of his thunderous powers and cast him down to Midgard as a mere mortal. Thor hoped that Loki would rush to his side. 3 days, he thought, would be enough. Instead, a full week passed before Loki finally appeared. Thor couldn't help wondering, if Loki truly cared, why the delay? Left alone and powerless, he almost convinced himself that their father's decree had been a cruel mistake. But Tony Stark, Jane Foster, and Daisy Johnson refused to let him fall into despair. They reminded him of Odin's true motives and urged him to reclaim his birthright. With their support, Thor's latent power surged back. In a flash of lightning, the god of thunder returned. Then came Loki's final revelation. Frigga had agreed to the armistice, and it specifically included Loki's exile. That struck Thor hardest of all. He knew better than anyone how deeply their mother loved them both. If Odin really was gone for good, if there was nothing left to hold him back, Thor realized he would carry his brother home with him, whether Frigga asked it or not. I'll make my way down to the other realm as soon as I can to deliver the news in person. It seems I can't fool you, brother. Then I have no choice but to kill you. The instant Loki witnessed Thor's own transformation, he summoned a divine spear, and his body snapped into a living suit of armor. He hefted the spear aloft. A brilliant column of light shot down from the heavens, and in that flash, Loki's form dissolved into mist. Thor sprang forward to give chase, but he stopped cold when he felt the depth of power Loki had just unleashed. The clear sky blackened, roiling with thunderheads more fearsome than any summoned by Mjolnir. On the shoreline, a towering figure of unknown metal rose up, its surface gleaming beneath the storm's fury. Fishermen and beachgoers scattered. Jane stared at the colossal construct in stunned silence. "What is that? Jane! Daisy! Get back!" Thor's voice thundered across the sand as he recognized his enemy. "Call Tony Stark, now!" Jane hesitated, torn between fear and duty, as Thor braced himself against the rising wind. Thor's roar echoed through the chamber. Jane jolted when she heard it, grabbing Daisy's hand and bolting toward the exit. "Come on, I don't stand a chance on my own," Daisy called back. "If I'm still stuck protecting you, I'm even more doomed." Jane darted down the corridor, intending to retrieve her phone so she could call Tony Stark. He can teleport the destroyer, she reminded herself, recalling Loki's warning. Perhaps there had been some truth to it after all. At least the king was allowing Loki to bide his time, for now. Left alone, Thor turned his attention to the massive automaton stirring before him. The destroyer, guardian of the treasure vault, was awakening. Normally, only Odin himself could summon it from the lower realms, which meant his father was either alive or, in the worst case, deep in the Odin sleep. Thor refused to believe Odin would simply stand by while his own sons battled. With a wry half-smile, Thor raised Mjolnir. He knew better than anyone how lethal the destroyer could be. Without hesitating, he charged, hammer crackling, ready to face the fearsome sentinel head-on. Even facing him, you have to be flawless. Any lapse, and you'll get hurt. Damien summoned a massive surge of lightning into Mjolnir, then rocketed upward, hammer first, and slammed it against the destroyer's helmet. There was a single deafening clang as metal met metal. The blow left only a shallow dent in the destroyer's armor. It didn't crack it. "As I'd expect from my father's work," Damien said, genuine admiration in his voice. Unmatched hardness. The impact reactivated the destroyer, known as Toru. The plates around its head snapped open like torn bandages, revealing a searing golden core. With a low electric hum, Toru fired back. Damien was sent hurtling into the sky as a golden shockwave followed him upward. Just as the blow was about to land, Thor dropped low and narrowly avoided it. A golden beam of light shot skyward, missing him by barely a meter. Thor watched in awe as the beam cleaved through the clouds, instantly scattering the darkness and revealing a clear, cobalt sky. A bead of cold sweat formed on his brow. Had that strike hit him squarely, he'd surely be crippled, if not dead. "Thor, you look like you're in a spot of trouble," a voice called from the side. Thor whirled around and spotted a figure in gleaming red and gold armor hovering 100 meters away. "Jane didn't summon you so quickly," he said, wariness in his voice. Tony Stark folded his arms, hovering with effortless grace. "I didn't need Jane's signal," he replied with a smirk. "I saw the alien ship on approach, and I came straight here." No sooner had Tony spoken than lo, thunderous booms rolled across the sky as his repulsors powered up. Thor raised an eyebrow. "I have to admit," he said, "your firepower is more impressive than I expected." "Impressive." Tony tapped his helmet and grinned. "You haven't seen anything yet. Now isn't the time to discuss that." Saul studied the fallen metal giant at their feet. "Is this the alien that invaded Blue Star?" Damien met his gaze with calm confidence. "It's a long story. I'll explain everything once I've dealt with it." Saul's shoulders slackened in relief. "Right, let's finish this quickly." Damien gave a firm nod. Chapter 160, We Failed to Pierce the Enemy's Armor. Damien stepped forward and thrust both palms outward, channeling his repulsor energy into a devastating shockwave. The power flared, coalescing into a beam more than 2 meters wide. He had no intention of holding back against this towering metal behemoth, the Destroyer, whose soulless visage looked more machine than living creature. Normally, such a beam could slice clean through superalloys or tear apart tank hulls. Yet when Damien's full-power blast struck the Destroyer's gleaming armor, it merely hissed and caused the giant to stagger a few paces. Before the energy could gouge even a scratch, the Destroyer's massive gauntlet snapped up to absorb the impact. "Sir," Jarvis reported in Damien's helmet speakers, "we have failed to penetrate the enemy's armor." "Spare me the status update. I can see that." Damien growled, his eyes narrowing beneath the helmet's HUD. He palmed his arc reactor, readying for another shot, but for the first time he hesitated. No earthly alloy, or any weapon in his arsenal, had ever demonstrated such resilience. This is alien technology, pure and simple. Its hardness is off the charts. Thor, standing nearby with Mjolnir crackling in hand, called out over the din of battle. "Damien, hold him in place. I will finish this." Damien gave a curt nod. With renewed focus, he unleashed a sustained repulsor barrage, peppering the Destroyer's armored plates and buying Thor the precious seconds he needed. Meanwhile, Jarvis searched for a weakness in the creature's energy signature. Thor summoned a swirl of lightning, ready to hurl himself into the fray. Together, the two heroes would have to find a way past that impervious shell before the Destroyer struck back. Although Damien's strike couldn't breach the Destroyer's armor, it was enough to throw the giant construct off balance. He shouted his plan to Tony, who immediately opened fire with repulsor blasts to pin the enemy in place. Thor, knowing that only one decisive, thunder-charged blow could fell the Destroyer, made no hesitation. He swung Mjolnir high, summoning dark clouds that roiled overhead and crackled with electricity. A bolt of lightning struck the hammer's head, setting Thor's blonde hair ablaze with electric light and igniting a fierce glow in his eyes. Then, riding the storm's power, he lunged forward and aimed the full weight of his hammer at the Destroyer's exposed skull. At the last instant, however, the Destroyer's head pivoted. The broad, unprotected gap snapped shut, revealing a glowing energy chamber trained dead on at Thor. A point-blank blast from that makeshift cannon would shatter god and man alike. Yet Thor stood firm, because he was not fighting alone. Seizing Thor's trust, Damien's boot thrusters suddenly detonated. An immense shockwave rippled visibly through the air. Before anyone could react, he lunged forward and drove his fist into the Destroyer's midsection like a thunderclap. A deafening clang echoed across the sky, and although the Destroyer's armor held firm, the blow staggered the towering construct and sent its energy beam ricocheting skyward. The backlash blew apart the plating on Damien's palm, leaving his gauntlet cracked and smoking. In that instant, Thor hammered Mjolnir with both hands, swinging the hammer in a brutal arc toward the destroyer's neck. Lightning seethed around the hammerhead, and with an ear-splitting boom, the thunderstorm's raw energy engulfed the armor. The shock twisted the destroyer's torso violently. Unbalanced, the giant suit toppled sideways and slammed into the sea with a titanic splash. Damien and Thor barely had a moment to exchange triumphant glances before the ocean's surface fractured. From the waves, a brilliant golden beam shot upward, carving a glowing rift through the water and lighting the sky with ominous splendor. A monstrous surge of energy ripped through the night sky, and from the roiling sea emerged a colossal figure. The destroyer rose slowly at first, its twisted helm liquefying, then flowing back into its original shape. As the head snapped into place, ripples ran down its broad chest plate, the metal shifting with a low, grinding hum. "What the hell is that?" Damien muttered, his gaze flicking to the cracked gauntlet lying in two pieces on the deck, then back to the war-forged giant striding toward them. He swallowed hard. "Sorry about the armor." Sol's face went pale. He ran a hand through his hair. "I need to fess up," he stammered. "That is the destroyer, the sentinel guarding Asgard's vault. I activated it. By accident." Damien's jaw clenched. "My suit can take the hit, but after we deal with this thing, you're explaining why Asgardian constructs are showing up here." Sol's eyes widened. "Right. Why is your Asgardian toy wandering around in international waters?" Before Sol could say more, Damien blasted into the air on repulsor thrust and landed solidly 5 meters from Thor, who had just descended amid a crackle of lightning. The two heroes stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the towering destroyer, its vacant eyes burning like hot coals in the darkness. The gauntlet clicked a few times and slipped away, revealing a powerful, muscular right arm. Thor blinked in surprise as he took in the unexpected upgrade. "You're an inventor, aren't you?" Thor asked, eyeing the gleaming limbs. Even in the midst of battle, both heroes felt the stakes. Their enemy, the destroyer, had taken damage from their earlier attacks, but it was still a deadly adversary. Damien flexed his new arm, its pistons hissing as steel plates shifted into place. "Being an inventor doesn't mean I'm limited to gadgets alone," Damien replied with a wry grin. "If we want to win this quickly, there's no point holding back." Thor's brow furrowed. "I assumed one strike from you would finish the job." "Can you really blame me for dragging it out a little?" Damien quipped, though a spark of determination lit his eyes. Before Thor could respond, a second mechanical arm descended from above and snapped into position on his broken armor. Cables snaked into his suit, and with a soft hum, the assembly locked itself firmly in place. Damien tightened his gauntlet with resolve. "All right, let's end this, once and for all. Delaying any longer will only make matters worse." Damien's armor had just finished reassembling. He fixed his gaze on the destroyer, now only a few hundred meters away, and spoke. The moment the words left his lips, Thor's eyes widened as a surge of violet energy erupted across Damien's suit, an energy unlike anything he'd ever seen. The familiar gold and red plating rippled and deepened into a rich purple, and the arc reactor's once bright blue core glowed with a sinister violet hue, like the eyes of some infernal creature. Wisps of purple flame flickered along every joint and seam, enveloping Damien in an aura of raw, dangerous power. Thor swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He had expected some new weapon or gadget, but not this. Damien himself had become the ultimate weapon. "Don't ask," Damien said, smirking as he caught Thor's stunned look. "And I won't tell you." There was no doubt about it now. He'd activated void mode. Damien squared his shoulders and fixed his gaze on the destroyer looming before him. He knew that any hesitation would only let the battlefield spread further, turning the aftermath into an even more nightmarish cleanup. With no one else in sight, this was his chance to unleash his full power and end the fight quickly. Summoning every ounce of strength he had, Damien braced himself for the first strike, determined to bring this monstrous threat down before it could wreak any more havoc.